बताओ मुझे।
बैठी रहो वरना फिर से बेहोश हो जाओगी।
बताओ मुझे।
बैठी रहो।
मैं तुम्हारी गुलाम नहीं हूँ।
कहो बैठ जाओ।
कि ये नहीं सोच सकते कि मैं यूं ही तुम्हारी हो गई।
मैं जानता हूँ, इसीलिए तुम्हें मौका दे रहा हूँ मुझसे प्यार करने का, जो तुम अब तुम्हारे पास 365 डेज हैं। मैं वो सब कुछ करूंगा जिससे तुम मुझे प्यार। में तैयार हो जाओ क्योंकि जाने से पहले हमें कुछ चीजें खरीदनी है।
जाने से पहले? लेकिन कहाँ? ये किस बारे में बात कर रहे हो? मैं पोलैंड के अलावा और कहीं भी नहीं जाने वाली हूँ।
क्यों?
पर मेरे ख्याल से तुम यहाँ भेजे गए हो मेरी हर काम में मदद करने के लिए, इसलिए मैं चाहती हूँ कि तुम यहीं बैठो और खाने में मेरी मदद करो।
ओके।
बाहर निकलो वरना मैं।
वरना क्या? हिस्सा बन सकती हो जो तुम्हारी किस्मत में लिखा है।
किस्मत में नहीं लिखा, ये तुम करो।
कभी कभी अपनी किस्मत खुद बनानी पड़ती है।
Welcome to the Cine Flux. And today we are stepping into something genuinely complicated, a film that arrived like a storm, divided everyone who encountered it, and somehow refused to quietly disappear. If you have found your way here, I think you already sense that this one deserves more than a simple verdict. So pull in close. This is going to be a real conversation. There is a particular kind of film that makes you feel uneasy not just while you are watching it, but long after, not because it frightened you, not because it devastated you, but because you are not entirely sure what it was trying to say or whether it knew either. That is the space we are entering today. And I want to be honest with you from the very beginning. This will not be a simple essay. Because this film is not a simple film. It is a film that asks questions it does not always answer, that reaches for something it does not always grasp, and that somehow, despite everything working against it, left me with more to think about than I ever expected. That tension between what a film attempts and what it achieves is exactly where the Cine Flux lives. So let us begin. Let us talk first about the world this film arrived into. Because no film lands in a vacuum, and this one landed into a cultural atmosphere that was already charged, already turbulent, already in the middle of a conversation that had been building for years. The year was 2020. The world was in lockdown. Millions of people were confined to their homes, cut off from ordinary life, from ordinary connection, from the textured daily reality of other human beings. And into that particular void, that hunger for sensation, for drama, for any experience that felt larger than four walls, a Polish erotic thriller appeared on Netflix, seemingly from nowhere, and became one of the most watched films on the platform within days of its release. The title was 365 dni, known internationally as 365 days, and the conversation it ignited was immediate, passionate, bitterly divided, and in many ways still unresolved. Here is what I keep returning to when I think about the cultural moment this film was born into. It arrived at the precise intersection of two forces that had been pulling against each other in Western culture for several years. On one side, there was the ongoing global reckoning led by movements like Me Too, with the dynamics of power, consent, and desire, and specifically with how those dynamics had been romanticized in fiction for generations. On the other side, there are something older, something that had been present in popular romantic fiction long before any of this, a persistent, deeply embedded fantasy of intensity, of someone wanting you so completely that ordinary boundaries dissolve. These two forces were not new, but they had never collided quite so publicly, quite so nakedly, as they did in the weeks after 365 Days appeared on streaming. What this film understands, and this is the first genuinely interesting thing about it, is that this collision is not simply a moral one, it is an emotional one. It is about what human beings fantasize about and what human beings actually need, and the complicated, sometimes uncomfortable gap between those two things. The film did not create that gap. The gap was already there, sitting inside millions of readers who had grown up with a certain kind of romance novel, a certain kind of love story where the hero's obsession is framed as devotion, where captivity becomes closeness, where the removal of choice is reimagined as the ultimate act of being chosen. The film simply put it on screen, in color, with production design and a score, where it could no longer be safely private. The critical response was, to put it gently, not warm. Most mainstream critics found the film not just artistically lacking, but genuinely troubling in its framing of its central dynamic. Reviews pointed to what they described as a glamorization of kidnapping and coercion, dressed in the visual language of luxury and desire. The film was compared sometimes favorably by its defenders, more often critically by its detractors, to the 50 Shades of Grey phenomenon, another adaptation of romance fiction that had walked a similarly charged line between fantasy and real world implication. And yet, the audience response told a completely different story. Think about what that means for a moment. Here's a film that received widespread critical condemnation that was specifically called out by organizations working in the field of human trafficking for what they described as its dangerous romanticization of abduction, and it became a global streaming phenomenon almost overnight. It landed in the Netflix top 10 in dozens of countries simultaneously. It generated more social media conversation than almost any film released that year. It found an audience that was not passive, not thoughtless, and not simply unaware of the criticism. Many of the people who watched it, discussed it, and defended it were perfectly aware of the arguments being made against it. They watched it anyway. They found something in it anyway. That is not a moral absolution of the film, but it is a genuinely interesting cultural fact, and any honest essay about 365 days has to sit with it rather than dismiss it. What were those audiences responding to? What need was this film meeting? And what does the sheer scale of that response tell us about the cultural moment it was born into? A moment of isolation, of confined domesticity, of a world that had suddenly become very small and very quiet. Cinna Rally arrives at the exact intersection of artistic ambition and cultural hunger, but sometimes a film, even a flawed one, finds the nerve of something real. Whether 365 Days handled what it found responsibly is a different question entirely. In terms of awards, the film received no significant critical recognition in the Western festival circuit, which was size no one who has read the reviews. However, it was poll and submission consideration in certain categories and generated conversation domestically about the representation of Polish cinema internationally, though that conversation was itself conflicted, with some voices expressing discomfort at the idea that this particular film might represent Polish filmmaking on a global stage. It is worth noting that Poland has an extraordinarily rich cinematic tradition. Directors like Krzysztof Kiełkowski, Andrzej Wajda, Roman Polanski, and the arrival of 365 Days as the country's most internationally visible recent film was a strange, somewhat melancholy irony for those who cared about that tradition. Its streaming life has been remarkable. It did not simply peak and fade. It generated sequels, two of them, and maintained a presence in Netflix consumption data long after its initial moment passed. There is a second wave discovery quality to how it has been watched, people returning to it, watching it with friends to share the experience, watching it critically, watching it as a kind of cultural artifact in itself. It became, in a very real sense, a film about how we watch films, about what we look for in them, what we allow them to do to us, and what we ask them to mean. That metacritical dimension was never intended by its makers, but it arrived anyway, and it makes the film genuinely worth examining. Does it feel timeless or perfectly of its time? I think the honest answer is both and neither. The fantasy it engages with is genuinely old. It draws from a lineage of captivity romance that stretches back through the genre's history. But the particular cultural friction it generated is entirely of the moment it arrived in. In 10 years, it may read as a document of a very specific cultural tension rather than a universal story. And that too is a form of meaning worth taking seriously. Now, let us talk about the film itself. 365 DNA in its original Polish was released in 2020, directed by Barbara Bierhaus and Romances Mendes. It is based on the first novel in a trilogy by Polish author Blanka Lipiszka, who also co-wrote the screenplay. The film stars Anna Maria Sieklucka as Lara Biel, a Polish woman whose life takes an extraordinary and violent turn when she is abducted by a Sicilian crime boss named Massimo Torricelli, played by Michele Morrone. Massimo informs Lara that he is giving her 365 days, one full year, to fall in love with him, during which time he promises not to touch her without her consent. What follows is the story of what happens within that year, set against the backdrops of Warsaw, Sicily, and a version of luxury that the film renders in very specific visual terms. The genre is erotic romance thriller, or more precisely, it occupies the space that 50 Shades of Grey carved out in mainstream popular culture, that contested territory between romance and something darker, between fantasy and provocation. But it is also a Polish film made by Polish filmmakers with a sensibility that carries traces of European cinema, even as it reaches for the aesthetics of a glossy international production. That combination creates a texture really unusual and genuinely worth examining rather than dismissing. What kind of story is this at its heart? That is, I think, the most important question to ask before anything else. On the surface, it is a love story, or rather, the story of how something begins to resemble a love story. Beneath the surface, it is grappling, imperfectly, often clumsily, but genuinely, with questions about the nature of desire, the relationship between power and intimacy, and what it means to be truly seen by another person in a world that has reduced you to your function. Laura, before her abduction, is a woman who is professionally successful but personally unsatisfied in a relationship that meets the requirements of a relationship without meeting the requirements of her own emotional life. She is going through the motions of living rather than actually living, and into that particular emptiness arrives something that, however problematically framed, is at least real, at least honest, at least felt. Barbara Białas and Tomasz Mendes approached this material from the world of commercial Polish television, and their visual sensibility reflects that background, slick, confident with the camera in moments of beauty and spectacle, occasionally flatter in the more dramatically demanding scenes. Michele Morrone, who plays Massimo, is an Italian actor and musician who brought a physical presence and a certain raw charisma to the role that the film depends upon entirely. Without genuine chemistry between the leads, the entire construction collapses. Anna Maria Sieklucka carries the film's emotional weight with more subtlety than the material sometimes allows her, and there are moments where her performance reaches past the screenplay into something more genuinely felt. Should you watch this film? That depends entirely on what you are looking for. If you come to cinema primarily for story rigor, complex characterization, or thematic coherence, you would almost certainly find 365 Days frustrating. If you come to cinema for pure sensation, visual spectacle, and the experience of watching two performers generate genuine electricity on screen, There are moments here that deliver exactly that. And if you come as the Cine Flux does, looking for the interesting questions if it raises whether or not it answers them, then yes. Absolutely yes. There is more here to think about than its detractors have acknowledged, and more here to question than its defenders have admitted. That space in between is where we are going. Let me tell you about the first time I sat with this film. I came to it late, not in that first wave of lockdown discovery, not in the moment when everyone seemed to be watching it simultaneously and the internet was alive with reactions ranging from outrage to obsession. I came to it quietly, alone, after the noise had settled somewhat, after the think pieces had been written and the counter arguments had been published and the cultural conversation had moved on to its next urgent subject. I came to it, in other words, with a full knowledge of what I was walking into: the criticisms, the defenses, the cultural context, the box office numbers, the streaming records. I knew the arguments before I knew the film. And I think that is actually the worst possible way to encounter any piece of cinema, because it means you are watching with borrowed eyes rather than your own. So I tried, as I always tried, to set all of that aside, to simply be present with what was on screen, to watch it the way you watch something in the dark before the world has told you what to think about it. What struck me in the very first minutes was something I had not expected at all. I had expected provocation. I had expected glossiness. I had expected the kind of filmmaking that knows exactly how much it can show and positions every frame to maximize that knowledge. And those things were pleasant, yes. But what I had not expected was the melancholy. The film opens not with luxury, not with Sicily, not with any of the imagery that would come to define it in the cultural conversation. It opens with loss, with a man watching someone he loves being taken from him in an act of violence he cannot prevent, with the particular helplessness of someone who holds enormous power in every other dimension of his life suddenly reduced to witness. And what the film understands in this opening, what it does quietly and without announcement, is that it is establishing the wound that everything else will grow from. Massimo Torricelli, before he is the man who imprisons Laura, is first a man who was unable to hold on to someone he loved. He is, in his origin, a person defined by loss rather than by possession. That does not justify anything that follows, but it contextualizes it in a way that makes the film more psychologically interesting than its surface would suggest. When I first sat with this film, I expected something closer to pure fantasy, hermetically sealed from emotional reality, concerned only with sensation and spectacle. What I found instead was a film that was genuinely attempting, however imperfectly, to understand something about the psychology of obsession, about how grief and longing can, in certain people and certain circumstances, transmute into a kind of reaching, a desperate, irrational, sometimes frightening need to hold on to the image of something lost. Massimo does not simply want Laura. He needs her to exist in a specific way for him, to confirm something he cannot otherwise confirm. And that need, rendered on screen with this kind of intensity, is genuinely unsettling in ways that go beyond the obvious moral questions the film raises. The atmosphere the film creates from its earliest moments is built from very specific ingredients. There is the visual language of luxury, Sicilian coastlines, marble interiors, yachts cutting through blue water, tailored suits and structured gowns rendered with a kind of saturated beauty that is deliberate and knowing. The film wants you to understand that this is a world of surfaces, a world in which wealth functions as both insulation and imprisonment, where the abundance of beautiful things creates its own kind of emptiness. Nora's life before her abduction is equally surface rich and emotionally hollow. Her apartment is beautiful, her wardrobe is elegant, her boyfriend is present and entirely absent at the same time. And the film, and here is something I keep returning to, is quietly asking whether the gilded cage of Massimo's world is really so different from the gilded cage Laura was already living in. Whether the captivity she is placed into is, in some ways, a more honest version of the captivity she was already experiencing. That is a genuinely uncomfortable idea. And I want to be clear that the film does not fully earn the right to ask it, because it does not do the necessary work to establish Laura's pre-abduction life with the depth and specificity that would make such a parallel truly meaningful. It sketches rather than draws. It implies rather than reveals. But the implication is there, and it is real, and it adds a layer of psychological texture to what might otherwise be pure spectacle. The pacing of those early scenes is worth examining carefully because it tells you a great deal about what kind of film this is and what it is genuinely capable of. The directors Beauvage and Mendes move through the establishment of Laura's world quickly, almost impatiently, as if they know that the audience's real investment begins with the moment of rupture rather than the world that precedes it. There's a restlessness to the editing in these early sequences, a forward momentum that feels less like artistic intention and more like an awareness of what kind of film they are making and what the audience has come for. And yet, within that restlessness, there are individual images that carry genuine weight. A look exchanged across a hotel lobby in Warsaw, a brief gesture of dismissal from Laura's partner that lands like a small death, a shot of Laura at a window that frames her as someone looking out from inside a life that does not quite fit. The moment the film shifts gear, the moment of Laura's abduction, is handled with a clarity and an abruptness that is, I think, one of the film's more interesting directorial choices. It does not build to it with elaborate suspense. It arrives suddenly, the way these things actually arrive without warning or preparation, and the film's refusal to sensationalize the event itself, to linger on it, to construct it as a set piece, creates a strange kind of matter of factness that is more disorienting than drama would have been. And then we are in Sicily, and then we are in Massimo's world, and then the film becomes something else entirely. What strikes me most about the central dynamic between Laura and Massimo, and what I think has been most misread in the cultural conversation around this film, is that it is not, or at least is not only, a straightforward fantasy of submission and dominance. There is something more complicated happening in the space between these two people, something that the film gestures toward even when it lacks the craft to fully articulate it. Laura is not passive. She is not a cipher onto whom Massimo projects his desire and who simply receives it. She is someone who engages, who refuses, who makes demands of her own, who tests the boundary of the promise Massimo has made her, that he will not touch her without her consent, with a kind of deliberate, intelligent provocation. She is, in other words, a participant in what is happening, even within the constraints of her situation. And the film is interested in that participation, in the question of what it means to begin to want something you did not choose, to find desire in a place that was defined by its absence of choice. Now, I want to be careful here because this is precisely the territory where honest analysis has to be most rigorous. The film's treatment of this dynamic is not beyond criticism. Not remotely. The fact that Laura begins to feel something genuine within a situation that began as coercion is not presented with the psychological complexity or the moral seriousness that such a development would require in order to feel earned rather than convenient. The screenplay frequently prioritizes the aesthetics of the situation, the beauty of the locations, the physical presence of the leads, the tactile pleasures of the world they inhabit, over the inner life of the characters who are supposed to be changing within it. And that imbalance creates a fundamental problem at the film's core that no amount of visual craft can fully resolve. But here is what I keep returning to. The question the film is trying to ask, even if it does not ask it well, is a genuinely human one. What happens to desire when it develops in a space that was not designed for it? What happens when the person you begin to feel something for is also the person who removed your freedom? Can something authentic grow in conditions that are by definition inauthentic? These are not trivial questions. They are questions that human beings have grappled with throughout history, in circumstances ranging from the literary to the devastatingly real. The film does not answer them with the care they deserve. But the fact that it is asking them at all, that beneath the surface of a glossy erotic thriller there is a psychological inquiry of some genuine seriousness, is worth acknowledging. This story unfolds across a series of what I would call pressure points, moments where the dynamic between Laura and Massimo is tested, renegotiated, or deepened in ways that push against the boundaries both characters have established. There is a scene, and I will not describe it in detail, but I want to speak to what it achieves, in which Laura asserts herself in a way that completely reframes the power dynamic the film has been building. She makes a choice that is entirely her own, within a situation she did not choose, and that act of autonomous desire is the film's most psychologically interesting moment. It is the moment where the film's central question becomes most acute, because the choice she makes is real. It comes from her. It cannot be attributed to coercion or manipulation. It is simply what she wants. And what does it mean when someone genuinely wants something within a situation that began as a removal of wanting? The film does not fully answer that question, but it asks it directly in that moment, and the asking matters. Think about it this way. The most honest love stories, the ones that actually illuminate something about human experience, are almost never about people who meet in perfect conditions and choose each other freely from a position of complete autonomy. They are about people who find each other in the mess of circumstance, in situations that are complicated and imperfect and sometimes compromised, and who have to decide what to do with what they feel. The question of whether what grows between Laura and Massimo qualifies as love is one the film is genuinely interested in, even if it approaches that question with tools that are not always equal to the task. The character of Laura deserves particular attention here because she is the film's true center of gravity, whatever the surface dynamics might suggest. Laura is introduced to us as a woman who is, in a very specific sense, not fully present in her own life. She is performing rather than living, performing the role of successful professional, performing the role of satisfactory partner, performing the role of someone whose life is going the way a life is supposed to go. There is a quality of detachment in Sieklucka's early performance that reads as characterization rather than limitation, and it becomes more meaningful in retrospect. Laura before Cicely is someone waiting, without knowing she is waiting, someone for whom her own life has become a kind of comfortable absence, and the violence of her removal from that life, as disturbing as it is in its actual execution, strips away the performance and forces her into genuine presence for perhaps the first time in a very long while. That is not a justification of what Massimo does. Let me be absolutely clear about that. But it is a psychological observation about what the film is attempting to trace, the arc of a woman who moves from performed living to something more genuinely felt through a process that the film cannot fully redeem but also cannot entirely dismiss. The question is whether you believe that arc, and the answer depends almost entirely on whether you believe Sieklucka's performance in the moments where it has to carry the most weight. In those moments, I think she does something more interesting than the film deserves. There is a particular quality to her stillness, the way she watches Massimo across a room, or processes something he has said, or holds herself in a moment of decision, that suggests a rich inner life that the screenplay does not always give access to. She is playing someone whose inner experience is more complex and more genuine than the situation she is in would normally permit, and that gap between the depth she suggests and the depth the film actually provides is one of its most poignant qualities. Massimo, as played by Michele Morrone, is a more straightforwardly constructed figure, and the film is in some ways honest about this. He is assembled from genre archetypes that are ancient and familiar: the dangerous man who is capable of tenderness, the powerful man whose power cannot protect him from vulnerability, the obsessive who cannot distinguish between love and possession because he has never been required to learn the difference. Morone inhabits these archetypes with a physicality and a charisma that makes them feel inhabited rather than simply performed. There is a scene in which Massimo demonstrates genuine restraint, in which he has every structural power to take what he wants and instead holds himself back, visibly at real cost. And it is this scene more than any other that makes the character function, because it is in restraint rather than action that character is revealed. And for a film that is frequently criticized for glamorizing transgression, the moments of deliberate restraint are quietly significant. The pacing of the film as a whole reflects a particular kind of storytelling logic that is rooted more in the romance novel tradition than in the cinematic one, and that is worth examining rather than simply criticizing. Romance fiction, the genre this film belongs to, however, uneasily operates on an emotional logic rather than a narrative one. It is not particularly concerned with the sequence of events or the structural architecture of cause and effect. It is concerned with the accumulation of feeling, with building through repetition and variation a particular emotional state in the reader or viewer, a sense of sustained intensity that is its own kind of meaning. The long montage sequences, the repeated cycles of tension and release, the way the film returns again and again to the same emotional registers, these are not directorial failures. They are the grammar of the genre. Whether you find them effective or exhausting depends on whether you are willing to meet the film on its own terms. And here is the part I keep coming back to, the moment where the film shifts completely. It arrives not in an act of drama or revelation, but in a quieter place than you might expect. There is a moment, roughly midway through the film, where Laura is no longer simply responding to Massimo, where she is for the first time genuinely initiating, where the direction of desire reverses, or at least becomes mutual, and the film's central question moves from what is being done to Laura to what Laura is choosing. It is a subtle shift in a film that is rarely subtle, and it is the hinge on which everything that follows turns. The film knows this, the camera knows this, and in this moment, whatever else you might say about 365 days, something genuinely cinematic happens. A story and a character and a camera all arrive at the same understanding at the same time, and for a brief, real, earned moment, the film becomes exactly what it was trying to be. Now let us step behind the frame entirely. Let us talk about how this film was actually made, because the story of its production is, in its own way, as interesting as the story it tells, and understanding where a film comes from changes how you see every choice it makes. 365 days began as so many things begin, with a book. Blanka Lipish's novel, published in Poland in 2018, was not at the time of its publication considered a work of major literary ambition. It was published as popular fiction, genre fiction, the kind of book that circulates through certain reading communities with the intensity of a shared secret. But its reception in Poland was immediate and substantial. It sold in extraordinary numbers for a debut novel. It generated the kind of passionate, divided response, readers who found it intoxicating alongside readers who found it troubling, that tells you a work has touched something real in the culture it was born from. And it did something that popular fiction of this kind very rarely does in Poland. It sparked a conversation that went beyond the literary world and into the broader public sphere, into discussions about gender and desire and the stories women tell themselves about both. Lipieska, who reportedly approached the material as a personal creative act rather than a calculated commercial exercise, co-wrote the screenplay adaptation herself. That decision, to keep the source material's author at the center of its translation to screen, is a significant one, and it shapes the film in ways both positive and limiting. The positive dimension is authenticity, the emotional logic of the story, the internal experience of its characters, the particular quality of desire it is trying to capture. These are rendered with the directness of someone who knows exactly what she was reaching for when she wrote the original. The limiting dimension is the difficulty of self-editing, of the distance a writer needs from their own work to see where it requires compression, expansion, or fundamental rethinking in the transition from page to screen. There are moments in the film where a scene goes on slightly longer than it needs to, or where the emotional beat being struck is the same one that was struck two scenes earlier, and these moments have the quality of a writer who loves her material so completely that she cannot bring herself to cut it. That is a human quality. It is also occasionally a structural one. The directors Barbara Bauhaus and Tomasz Mendes came to this project from backgrounds in Polish commercial television and music video production, and that lineage is visible throughout the film, both in what it enables and in what it constrains. What it enables is a genuine facility with visual rhythm, with the choreography of image and music, with the kind of sensory cinema that does not depend on dialogue or plot mechanics to create its effect. The long sequences of travel, of movement through beautiful spaces, of two bodies existing in proximity to each other without words. These are handled with a confidence and a fluency that reflects the visual instincts of filmmakers who understand how to make images feel alive. What the television background occasionally constrains is the deeper grammar of cinematic storytelling, the patience with silence, the trust in implication, the willingness to leave things unresolved in ways that allow an audience to do their own psychological work. Television trains you to be clear, to be legible, to never let the audience get lost. Cinema, particularly the kind of cinema that deals with interior experience, sometimes needs to allow a certain productive lostness, a certain space in which meaning is felt rather than delivered. And 365 Days, in its more dramatically demanding moments, occasionally opts for clarity when ambiguity would have served it better. What is remarkable about the film's origin story, and this is the first of the production facts I want to weave into this conversation, is that Michele Morrone, who plays Massimo Torricelli, was reportedly not an established film presence at the time of his casting. He was an Italian singer and model, a face and a physical presence without a substantial screen career. And the decision to build a film of this scale and with this kind of central dependence on chemistry around someone who had not yet proven himself cinematically was, according to various accounts of the production, a genuine creative gamble. The producers reportedly saw something in his screen test that convinced them the gamble was worth taking, a quality of stillness combined with intensity, of physical presence combined with emotional accessibility that is extraordinarily difficult to manufacture and cannot be taught. And watching the film with that knowledge changes how you see certain early scenes. Scenes where Morone is asked to carry enormous emotional weight with very little dialogue, relying entirely on what he can communicate through his body and his eyes. In those scenes, you can see the gamble paying off. You can see someone discovering in real time what they are capable of on screen. There is an aliveness to his performance in these moments that a more experienced actor, more settled into the technique, might not have produced. Sieklucka's casting is its own remarkable story. Anna Maria Sieklucka was, according to interviews and production accounts, relatively unknown outside the Polish theatre world before this film. She had stage experience, a trained actor's relationship to character and intention, but had not been tested in the particular demands of screen performance at this scale. The casting process was reportedly extensive. The production understood that the entire film rested on whether you believed Laura's journey, and that you could only believe Laura's journey if you believed the person making it. Sieklucka's selection from what was reportedly a very large pool of candidates suggests that what the directors were looking for was not simply beauty or obvious star quality, though she possesses both, but something more specific and more difficult to name, a quality of interiority, a sense that there is a great deal happening beneath the surface that the camera can access but that language cannot fully capture. And watching her in the film's quieter moments, in the spaces between the film's more spectacular sequences, you can understand exactly what they saw. She has a quality of authentic presence that is genuinely rare. The ability to be on screen and simply be without performing the act of being, without letting technique announce itself, is the hardest thing for a film actor to achieve. And she achieves it more consistently than the film perhaps deserves. The decision to film in Sicily was not purely an aesthetic one, though the aesthetic rewards are undeniable. According to various production accounts, the Sicilian locations were chosen in part for what they represent symbolically. The island as a world unto itself, separated from the mainland, operating according to its own rules and its own history, beautiful and enclosed, and carrying within its beauty a certain darkness that is entirely its own. Sicily has a cinematic history that runs through some of the most significant works of Italian and world cinema. The Godfather, Cinema Paradiso, Il Postino, and invoking that visual landscape carries weight whether or not the film explicitly acknowledges the reference. When Lara arrives in Sicily, she arrives in a place that feels genuinely other, genuinely removed from the world she knows, and the location work earns that feeling rather than simply asserting it. The particular quality of the light, the ancient stone against the vivid sea, the way the landscape seems to carry the weight of centuries while remaining entirely sensuously present, The cinematography captures all of this with a genuine love for the material. The production design deserves serious attention because it is doing more meaningful work in this film than it is typically given credit for. Every space that Laura inhabits throughout the film is designed to communicate something about her relationship to that space, about power, about comfort, about the difference between being surrounded by beauty and genuinely belonging somewhere. Massimo's villa is extraordinary and specifically curated. It is the home of someone who has surrounded himself with the finest things available and arranged them with the precision of a person who uses beauty as both armor and statement. It is beautiful in a way that is also slightly airless, slightly controlled, beautiful in the way that something is beautiful when it has been made to be looked at rather than lived in. And what happens across the film, one of its subtler achievements, is that the spaces gradually feel less curated and more inhabited as Laura's presence begins to change them. Her things begin to appear, her choices begin to register on the environment. The villa becomes by degrees almost too subtle to notice in a single viewing, something more like a home. That transformation is largely accomplished through production design rather than through dialogue or explicit narrative, and it is genuinely skillful work. The costumes, designed with considerable care and intentionality, function in much the same way. Laura's wardrobe across the film is a visual language in itself, beginning with the structured, professional, somewhat defended clothing of her Warsaw life and gradually softening, opening, becoming more sensuous and more genuinely expressive as her sense of self begins to change within her circumstances. The progression is deliberate and readable, the kind of visual storytelling that allows an audience to track a character's inner journey through purely external means. It is not a new technique. Costume as characterization is one of cinema's oldest tools, but it is applied here with a specificity and an intelligence that elevates the overall craft of the film. Now, and this is a production fact that reshapes how you see several crucial scenes. It has been reported in various interviews with the cast and crew that many of the film's most intimate sequences were choreographed with a specificity and a care that goes beyond what the final product might suggest on a surface reading. The intimacy coordinator model, a relatively recent development in film production that emerged partly in response to the broader conversations about on-set conduct that were happening during and after the Me Too period, was applied to the more vulnerable scenes between the leads. What this means, in practical terms, is that the sequences which most visibly provoked moral debate about the film's content were actually created in conditions of considerable professional care and mutual consent between the performers. There is something both reassuring and genuinely interesting about that fact. Reassuring for obvious reasons, and interesting because it introduces a kind of metacritical dimension. Here is a film whose content is criticized for its depiction of the absence of consent made in conditions in which consent was specifically professionally foregrounded at every stage. The gap between representation and reality is one that any honest discussion of this film must acknowledge. The score, composed and assembled with a heavy reliance on contemporary pop and R&B music rather than a traditional orchestral soundtrack, is one of the film's most strategically intelligent decisions and one of the elements that contributed most directly to its particular cultural reach. The decision to build the film's emotional landscape around contemporary music rather than composed score gave it an immediacy, a sense of existing in the present cultural moment that a traditional soundtrack could not have provided. The songs function not just as emotional accompaniment but as cultural signaling. They locate the film in a specific world of contemporary sensibility. They speak a musical language that the film's target audience already has an emotional relationship with, and they create a kind of shortcut to intimacy that purely instrumental music would have taken much longer to achieve. The most memorable musical choices in the film are those where the lyrical content of a song either mirrors or ironizes the emotional content of the scene it accompanies, where the words of the music are in conversation with what is happening on screen, creating a layer of meaning that rewards attention rather than simply providing atmosphere. There is one particular musical choice in a sequence that many viewers have identified as the film's most visually striking set piece, where the interplay between image and music achieves something genuinely cinematic, something that neither the image nor the music could accomplish alone. I will speak more about this sequence when we arrive at it in our discussion of the film's achievements because it deserves careful attention rather than passing mention. The production timeline and release strategy are also worth noting because they shaped how the film was received in ways that are easy to overlook in retrospect. 365 Days was released in Polish cinemas in February 2020, just weeks before the COVID-19 pandemic would force the closure of theaters across the world. Its theatrical run was, as a result, significantly curtailed, and the film might have faded quietly into the history of moderately successful Polish commercial cinema had its acquisition by Netflix not placed it directly in front of a global audience that was, at precisely that moment, confined to their homes and hungry for exactly the kind of absorbing, sensory, emotionally charged experience the film provides. The timing of its Netflix availability, arriving in June 2020 in the deep middle of lockdown across much of the world, was not the result of strategic planning on the part of its makers. It was a coincidence of circumstance that became one of the most significant factors in the film's extraordinary global reach. That is a genuinely interesting fact about how cinema functions in the streaming age, about how the conditions under which a film is encountered shape what it becomes in the culture. 365 Days was not made for a global streaming audience. It was made for a Polish audience in Polish, drawing on a specifically Polish cultural and literary tradition, with production values and ambitions calibrated to that context. Its transformation into a global phenomenon was an accident of timing and distribution, and the film carries within it, in its specificity of place, its particular emotional register, its very Polish quality of romantic fatalism, the traces of its original intended audience. That specificity, paradoxically, is part of what gave it its universal reach. It felt like something real rather than something manufactured for global consumption. And in the landscape of streaming content, which increasingly tends toward a calculated internationalism that can feel airless and anonymous, a film that feels genuinely rooted in a specific cultural soil is recognizably different, recognizably alive. There is one further production detail I want to linger on because it is both the most humanly interesting and the one that most directly reshapes how you see the performance at the film center. Michele Morrone, who plays Massimo, was reportedly going through a personally difficult period in his life during the filming of this production. He has spoken in various interviews about the professional and personal challenges he was navigating at the time, about a sense of starting over, of putting everything into something without the certainty of how it would be received, of arriving at this role from a place of genuine personal vulnerability rather than professional confidence. I want to be careful about how I use this information because the private lives of performers are their own, and the distance between lived experience and screen performance is never simple or direct. But what I will say is this: there is a quality in Morone's performance of Massimo, particularly in the scenes where the character's control begins to break down, where the carefully maintained facade of power begins to show its cracks, that feels less like acting and more like accessing, less like construction and more like recognition. Where that quality comes from the personal circumstances reportedly surrounding the performance, or simply from a natural talent that the role was uniquely suited to draw out, is impossible to say with certainty. But the quality is there, and it is part of what makes the film more emotionally alive than its detractors typically acknowledge. Now let us move from how the film was made to what the film actually achieves, because these are two different conversations, and the second is in some ways the more important one. The first thing I want to say about what 365 Days achieves is also the most counterintuitive, and it is this: it achieves chemistry, real, undeniable on screen chemistry between its two leads in a way that is extraordinarily difficult to manufacture, and that no amount of directorial skill or production design can substitute for. Chemistry between performers is one of cinema's most mysterious and irreducible qualities. It cannot be scripted, it cannot be designed, it cannot be constructed in the editing room after the fact. It either exists or it does not, and between Sieklucka and Morrone it genuinely verifiably exists. There is a scene relatively early in their shared screen time where the two characters exist in the same space, and the camera simply watches them navigate that proximity. Nothing significant happens, no dramatic event occurs. But the air between them carries a charge that the screen cannot entirely contain. It is the kind of scene that only works when both performers are genuinely present with each other rather than simply executing their blocking, and it works here in a way that is quietly remarkable. Chemistry of this kind is not simply physical attraction, though physical attraction is certainly part of it. It is more accurately described as mutual legibility, two people who can read each other on screen with a specificity and a responsiveness that creates the impression of a shared inner life. When Morrone looks at Sieklucka in the film's most charged moments, you believe that he's seeing something real, not just a beautiful face, not just the object of desire, but a specific person with a specific quality that is irreplaceable to him. And when Sieklucka responds to that, looking with wariness, with curiosity, with something that gradually, reluctantly begins to resemble its own kind of desire, the response has the quality of genuine psychological movement rather than scripted reaction. This is what performance is supposed to do at its best, and here in this unlikely film, in the service of a story that asks the most difficult questions about the ethics of desire, it does it. Let us talk about Anna Maria Sieklucka's work more specifically, because I think she deserves more careful critical attention than she has typically received in the conversation around this film. The conversation has generally focused on the film's moral and cultural dimensions to such an extent that the actual craft on screen has been insufficiently examined. And Sieklucka's craft, in the moments that demand it most, is genuinely impressive. There is a scene, and I will describe it carefully without reproducing dialogue, in which Laura confronts Massimo with the full complexity of her situation. Not with anger, not with obvious distress, but with a kind of measured, quiet clarity that is more devastating than either of those more legible emotions would have been. She says what she needs to say, and then she stops. And what Sieklucka does in the silence after she stops, what she holds in her face, what she allows and what she withholds, what she lets the camera access in that moment of absolute stillness, is the finest single piece of acting in the film, because she is playing someone who is both present and defended, someone who has said the truest thing she knows how to say and is now entirely vulnerable to its reception, and who will not show that vulnerability except in the most controlled and careful way. It is an enormously difficult emotional note to hit, the combination of honesty and self-protection, of openness and guardedness, and she hits it precisely. In that moment, whatever you might think of the film's moral framework or narrative logic, you are watching something genuinely true happen on screen. You are watching a human being, a fictional human being, but a convincing one, navigate the most dangerous emotional territory with a grace that the situation should not permit but somehow does. That scene earns the film more credit than almost anything else in it, because it demonstrates that the performers at the center of this story are capable of something beyond the pleasures the film is primarily being consumed for. It demonstrates that there is a version of the story, more carefully written, more deeply developed, with a screenplay equal to the performances at its center, that could have been genuinely extraordinary. The gap between what this film means and what it occasionally suggests it could be is one of the more poignant qualities of the experience of watching it. The visual language of 365 days is worth examining with real care because it is more considered than the film's surface impression might suggest. Biala Edge and Mendes approach the visual dimension of the material with an instinct for the geometry of desire, for how the positioning of bodies in space communicates the shifting power dynamics between them. In the film's early sequences, Lara is frequently framed at a distance from Massimo, across rooms, across vehicles, across the physical space of the various extraordinary environments they inhabit together. This spatial distance is not simply a production choice. It is a visual argument about where she stands in relation to him. Present in his world but not of it, close enough to be seen but far enough to maintain the separation that her situation requires. As the film progresses, that spatial distance narrows. The camera brings them together incrementally, frame by frame, sequence by sequence, until eventually the distance between them is reduced to the distance between one face and another, between one breath and the next. This visual grammar is simple, yes, but it is coherent, and in its coherence, it demonstrates a directorial understanding of how cinema communicates emotional change through purely spatial means. The use of light throughout the film is also worth pausing over. The Sicilian sequences are lit with an abundance, cold and warm, almost overripe, that is in deliberate contrast to the cooler, more restrained light of the Warsaw sequences that open the film. Laura's world before Sicily is rendered in the kind of clean, functional light that modern professional life tends to produce, clear, neutral, efficient, belonging to no particular hour of the day. The light of Massimo's word belongs absolutely to the hour, to late afternoon, to candlelight, to the particular quality of morning light on Mediterranean stone. It is light that has temperature, that has weight, that exists in time rather than simply eliminating space. And that distinction between timeless functional light and light that belongs somewhere specific and sensuous is a visual statement about the emotional contrast between the two worlds Laura inhabits. Her life before Sicily was well lit. Massimo's world is lit. There is a difference, and the film knows the difference even when it cannot articulate it in words. The cinematography in the water sequences, and there are several, each functioning as a kind of visual punctuation mark within the film's emotional structure, deserves particular attention. Water in cinema is one of the oldest symbolic vocabularies available to a director. It means cleansing, it means depths, it means the dissolution of boundaries, it means the possibility of a different kind of being, and the film uses it with a consistency that suggests genuine intention rather than simply a love of beautiful locations. Every significant water sequence in the film corresponds to a moment of emotional shift in Lara's interior life, a moment where something dissolves or deepens or becomes newly visible. The drowning and surfacing quality of these sequences, their immersive sensory, slightly vertiginous quality, mirrors the psychological experience the film is attempting to trace. Going under and coming up changed. The old thing released, the new thing not yet named. Now I want to talk about the film's most visually accomplished sequence, the one that, in my judgment, represents the film's single greatest achievement as a piece of cinema, and the one that most clearly demonstrates what this production was capable of when all of its elements aligned. I am referring to the sequence. You will know the one that is structured almost entirely as a music video, in which movement and image and sound are allowed to operate without the anchor of narrative or dialogue, simply as sensation and presence and the communication of something that cannot be put into words. What this sequence achieves is the film's central emotional argument in purely cinematic terms. Not through what the characters say or what they do in a narrative sense, but through the specific quality of their presence in a specific space at a specific moment, rendered in music and light, and the way one body moves in relation to another. It is a sequence that understands something about the relationship between physical intimacy and emotional truth, about how the body sometimes knows what the mind has not yet caught up with, how desire and understanding can arrive together in a moment that the language of plot cannot contain. Cinema rarely does this with this kind of directness and this kind of commitment. And the fact that it happens in this film, which is not by any measure a great film, makes it more remarkable rather than less. The score and the broader musical landscape of the film deserve extended consideration because music in 365 days is not decorative, it is structural, it is load bearing. And understanding what the musical choices are doing at each stage of the film fundamentally changes what you hear when you watch it. The decision to use contemporary music rather than original composition was, as I mentioned earlier, strategically intelligent in terms of culture reach, but it was also a specific creative choice that carries real artistic implications. Contemporary pop music, particularly the kind of atmospheric, emotionally charged R&B and electronic pop that the film draws on, operates on the principle of emotional shortcut. These are songs that already have emotional associations for the people listening to them. songs that carry accumulated feeling from the context in which they have been heard before. Parties, car journeys, private moments, the soundtrack of other people's memories. When the film deploys a song with this kind of accumulated emotional charge, it is not just providing atmosphere, it is activating a kind of emotional memory in the listener, reaching into a reservoir of feeling that already exists and directing it toward what is happening on screen. This can be a manipulative technique in the pejorative sense, but it can also, when used with intelligence and care, be a form of genuine emotional amplification, a way of making a film feel larger and more resonant than its narrative alone could achieve. The specific songs chosen for the most significant sequences are not random or interchangeable. Each one has been selected for a quality that corresponds to something specific in the scene it accompanies, a lyrical theme, a rhythmic quality, a tonal texture that adds a specific emotional dimension to what the image is already doing. The opening sequence uses music that is simultaneously yearning and melancholy, music that communicates loss and incompleteness in its very sonic texture, establishing before a single plot event has occurred the emotional register in which the whole film will operate. The music of the middle sections shifts towards something more urgent, more physically immediate, more concerned with the present moment and less with what has been lost or what might be gained. And the music of the film's final act, which I will discuss in more detail when we reach the spoiler section, carries a quality of suspension, of something held in the moment before it resolves. That is the perfect musical correlative for where the narrative has arrived. That is a specific moment in the film, a brief one easily overlooked, where the music stops entirely. No score, no source music, no ambient sound design. Just a specific texture of silence in a specific space at a specific moment between two specific people. What happens in that silence, what the film allows to exist without any sonic support, is one of the most genuinely brave choices in the entire production, because silence in film is terrifying. It removes the emotional scaffolding that music provides and asks the audience to remain present without it. It places everything on the performers and on the particular quality of the air in the room. And here, in this brief, unaccompanied moment, the film trusts its performers and its audience completely. The silence carries more than any musical choice could have, and what it carries is something the film has been building toward since its opening frames. The specific quality of two people whose understanding of each other has become, despite everything, real. The writing of the screenplay is an area where honest analysis requires both generosity and precision, because the script is doing some things with genuine skill and other things with considerably less. The structural architecture of the screenplay, the way it sequences its emotional beats, the rhythm of tension and release it creates, the gradual narrowing of emotional and physical distance between its central characters reflects a real understanding of how this kind of story generates its particular effect. Lipinska, as the source material's author translating her own work, understands the internal logic of what she is building better than any external adapter could have, and that understanding is visible in the screenplay's emotional coherence, even when its narrative logic is less than airtight. The dialogue, however, is the screenplay's most significant witness, and it is worth being direct about that. There are exchanges between the characters that function adequately as delivery systems for plot information or emotional position without generating the kind of linguistic texture that rich screen dialogue creates. The sense that these specific people in this specific moment could not have said anything other than exactly what they say. The best screen dialogue is specific to its speaker in a way that makes it feel inevitable. You could not transplant it to another character in another film because it belongs absolutely to this person and this situation. The dialogue in 365 Days is, in its most functional passages, more generic. It says what needs to be said, establishes what needs to be established, but does not have that quality of absolute specificity that would make it feel genuinely irreplaceable. The performers frequently elevate the material beyond what the words alone would suggest. Sieklucka in particular has a gift for finding emotional truth in lines that the screenplay has not fully earned, but the gap between what the dialogue provides and what the performances are reaching for is consistently visible. where the writing is most successful is in its structural intelligence, in the way it sequences the development of the central dynamic so that each stage feels emotionally logical even when it is narratively improbable. The script understands the psychology of what it is tracing. The gradual, reluctant, genuine emergence of something real in a situation that began as its opposite, and it sequences that emergence with the care for emotional plausibility that keeps the central relationship credible even as the external circumstances remain fantastical. The believability of the emotional arc is entirely dependent on the sequencing of its stages, and the screenplay gets that sequencing right in ways that are more subtle and more considered than its surface would suggest. There is also a quality of genuine wit in certain passages of the script, a dryness in Laura's responses to her situation, a refusal to be entirely serious about the absurdity of what is happening to her, that functions as both character revelation and tonal relief. Laura's relationship to the ridiculousness of her circumstances, her occasional inability to resist finding something genuinely funny in the extremity of what Massimo has created around her, is one of the script's most appealing qualities, and one that is easy to miss in a film that is primarily discussed in terms of its more charged dimensions. Humor, in the service of a story like this one, is not merely entertainment, it is a survival mechanism. It is the way a psychologically credible person maintains their sense of self within a situation that is designed to reduce them to pure response. And the fact that the screenplay gives Laura this quality of ironic resilience makes her significantly more three-dimensional than the surface reading of the story would suggest. What the film achieves then is a mixture of things that are genuinely impressive and things that fall short of what the material requires. It achieves real chemistry between its leads, chemistry that is the foundation on which everything else depends and that earns its position as such. It achieves synergy when we show up to do, and sustained love of image and light and the particular quality of extraordinary places that is more than mere aesthetics and functions as a form of emotional argument. It achieves a musical landscape that amplifies and extends the emotional register of the story with genuine intelligence and creative intent. It achieves in its finest scenes a quality of authentic performance that suggests dimensions of character and feeling beyond what the screenplay strictly provides. And it achieves in its most cinematically committed moments a genuinely sensory experience, the feeling of being inside a particular emotional state rather than simply observing it from outside. That is cinema at its most immediate and most honest. What it does not achieve, and we will explore this fully in the next movement, is a fully realized narrative, a screenplay that matches the ambitions of its performances, a moral seriousness equal to the moral complexity of its central situation, or a visual language that consistently operates at the level of its finest moments rather than occasionally reaching it and then retreating. The gap between the film's achievements and its shortcomings is the most interesting thing about it. It is a film of real, vivid, undeniable qualities that never quite becomes the film those qualities suggest it could be. And precisely that, is what makes it worth this conversation. Let us now do something that any honest essay must eventually do. Let us talk about where this film falls short, not with cruelty, not with the kind of dismissive brevity that passes for criticism in certain corners of cultural commentary, but with the same care and specificity that we have brought to everything else. Because a film's failures are as revealing as its achievements, and understanding precisely where and why a film does not reach what it was aiming for tells you something essential, not just about the film itself, but about the nature of the ambition behind it. The first and most fundamental flaw in 365 Days is one that no amount of chemistry, visual beauty, or musical intelligence can fully compensate for, and it is this: the film does not trust its own depth. There are moments throughout, moments I have already identified in our conversation, moments where the performances reach towards something genuinely complex and psychologically real, where the film, rather than following that reach with the patience and courage it demands, retreats to safer, more immediately legible emotional territory. It pulls back from its own most interesting questions precisely at the moments when those questions are most urgently pleasant. And that pattern of advance and retreat, of touching something real and then stepping away from it, is the structural wound at the heart of the film's experience. It is not a wound that makes the film unwatchable, but it is a wound that prevents it from being what its finest moments suggest it genuinely could be. Think about what that means in practical terms. A film that does not trust its own depth is a film that is constantly interrupting itself, cutting away from the difficult thing to the easier thing, from the question that requires sustained attention to the answer that provides immediate satisfaction. And in a film that is fundamentally about the difficulty of genuine intimacy, about the challenge of being truly known by another person and truly knowing them in return, this pattern of interruption is not merely a structural problem. It is a thematic one. It undermines the very thing the film is trying to say about the nature of connection. Because genuine connection, in life as in art, requires exactly the sustained presence and the willingness to remain with discomfort that the film repeatedly declines to demonstrate. The film is about depth while being afraid of depth, and that contradiction is present in every scene, where it chooses the montage over the moment, the spectacle over the silence, the movement over the stillness that would have been more true. The pacing is where this problem manifests most visibly, and I want to be precise about the nature of the pacing problem rather than simply asserting that it exists. The issue is not that the film moves too quickly in a general sense. There are films that move quickly and do so with complete artistic integrity because their speed is intentional and expressive rather than evasive. The issue in 365 days is that the pacing is inconsistent in a way that reveals uncertainty rather than intention. The film knows how to slow down for beauty, for the pleasure of a location, for the visual glamour of bodies in space, for the sustained sensory experience of its most charged sequences. But it frequently rushes past the dramatic and emotional content that would give those beautiful sequences their full meaning. Scenes that should bend, that should allow us to sit with a character's decision, to feel the weight of what is being chosen or refused or discovered, are compressed into moments, handled with an efficiency that leaves them underdeveloped and therefore underweighted. The consequence of this is that certain emotional transitions in the central relationship feel sudden in ways that undermine their credibility. When Laura's feelings begin to shift, when what she experiences in relation to Massimo begins to resemble something genuine rather than simply a psychological survival response to her situation, that shift needs to be earned through a sustained accumulation of specific moments, each one adding a further layer to our understanding of what is happening in her interior life. Instead, the film frequently jumps, cutting between a moment of resistance and a moment of something else entirely, skipping the in between territory where the real psychological work occurs. The emotional logic is there in outline, but the connective tissue is missing. And it is in the connective tissue, in the small, unspectacular, unglamorous moments of human beings actually changing in relation to each other, that the believability of a love story lives or dies. The secondary characters in the film represent another significant missed opportunity, and one that reveals something about the screenplay's priorities that is worth examining directly. Laura's best friend Olga, played with genuine energy and a natural comedic timing by Magdalena Lamparska, is perhaps the most vivid supporting presence in the film. She is given moments of genuine personality, of friendship rendered with warmth and specific chemistry, of a relationship between women that feels real rather than purely functional. And then, with remarkable regularity, she disappears from the narrative for extended periods, reappearing when the plot requires her presence without the film having done the work to maintain the continuity of her existence when she is off screen. The friendship between Laura and Olga is asserted rather than demonstrated. We are shown that they are close, told that their bond matters, but denied the sustained evidence of that closeness that would make their scenes together feel genuinely resonant rather than merely pleasant. This matters beyond the specific case of Olga's character, because the quality of Laura's relationships with other people who are not Massimo, people who exist in her life as friends and colleagues, and the ordinary social fabric of a human being's existence, is precisely the dimension that would make the central relationship's development most meaningful and most credible. If we knew Laura's world fully, if we understood what she was giving up, what she was leaving behind, what the texture of her ordinary life actually felt like. Then her transformation within Massimo's world would carry a weight and a specificity that the film, in its rush to get to Sicily, never quite achieves. Secondary characters are not decorative, they are the world the protagonist comes from. And the thinness of Laura's world before her abduction is a structural problem that ripples through everything that follows. Massimo's world has the same problem from a different angle. The crime world that supposedly defines his existence and makes him dangerous, the network of power and violence and obligation that is repeatedly gestured toward as the context of his life, is rendered as atmosphere rather than substance. We are given images and impressions, stylized suggestions of a world with its own rules and its own morality, but we are never given access to the actual textual of what that world demands from him, what it costs him, how it shapes the man he is. This matters because Massimo's capacity for violence, his genuine dangerousness, the dimension of him that is not about desire or loss but simply about power exercised without constraint, is one of the most important and most underexplored elements of the film. The film wants his dangerousness to be present and felt, to add a specific edge of risk to the central dynamic, but it does not want to examine what that dangerousness actually means, what it would actually cost to be in proximity to someone who operates the way Massimo operates. The crime world functions as backdrop and flavoring rather than as genuine character context, and the result is a dimension of Massimo's identity that feels decorative rather than real. The tonal inconsistency of the film is a related problem and one that the film's background in commercial television and music video production probably contributes to. There are moments in 365 Days that are genuinely tonally sophisticated, moments where the film holds comedy and menace, warmth and unease, fantasy and psychological reality in genuine tension, without resolving that tension too quickly or too cleanly. These moments are the ones where the film feels most artistically alive, most genuinely interesting. And then there are moments where the tonal balance collapses, where the film seems uncertain whether it is a thriller or a romance or a fantasy or something closer to a psychological study, and instead of committing to any of these registers, it defaults to a kind of glossy neutrality that is visually pleasant and emotionally inert. The comedy sequences in particular feel slightly misaligned with the rest of the film, not because comedy is inappropriate in this context, but because the specific quality of the comedy, its register and its rhythm, does not quite match the emotional world that the more serious sequences have been building. The tonal gear changes are occasionally jarring in ways that pull you out of the film's spell at precisely the moments when sustained immersion would have been most valuable. There is also a specific dramatic problem in the final third of the film that I want to address directly, because it represents the clearest example of the screenplay not finding the storytelling solution that the emotional situation required. Without moving yet into full spoiler territory, we will do that in our next section. I want to observe that the film's management of its climactic emotional revelations is hurried in a way that the preceding narrative does not prepare you for. The film has spent a considerable amount of its running time carefully, incrementally building toward something, toward an emotional state in its central characters and in its audience that requires a specific kind of culmination, a specific quality of resolution or resolution. And then in its final movement, the film rushes. It accelerates when it should deepen, it resolves when it should sit with, and the result is a final experience that feels slightly misaligned with what the body of the film has been building, as though the film has been writing a sentence with great care and then ended it too abruptly before the thought was complete. I want to be fair about what this flaw is and what it is not. It is not a fatal wound. The film survives it, in the sense that the emotional investment it has generated in the audience by this point carries sufficient momentum to bring you to the ending with your engagement intact. But it is a real wound, the kind of wound that leaves you feeling, as the credits begin to roll, that the film has not quite given you what it promised. Not because of anything it failed to provide on the surface, not because of any specific scene or sequence that is missing, but because of a quality of emotional completion that the final minutes do not achieve. The film sets up a particular kind of emotional architecture and then, in its closing moments, does not fully inhabit the space it has built. You arrive at the ending carrying more feeling than the ending knows what to do with. And that excess, that unmet emotional expectation, is the most honest measure of both what the film achieved and where it finally fell short. The representation of the central dynamic's moral dimension is the area where the film has received the most sustained criticism, and while I have already touched on this in our earlier discussion, I want to address it now with the specific framing of a creative flaw rather than a moral one. Because here is the thing, the moral complexity of the central situation, the question of what it means that Laura's feelings develop within a context of coercion, the question of whether what grows between these two people can legitimately be called love, the question of what the film is ultimately endorsing by allowing its narrative to move toward resolution rather than consequence. These are not questions that a film like this can simply ignore. They are questions that the film has introduced by choosing this particular story, and the responsibility for addressing them belongs to the work, and the work on the whole does not address them with the seriousness they require. The film makes a series of choices in its framing, in its musical landscape, in its visual grammar, in the quality of light it brings to particular sequences that consistently invite the audience to experience the central dynamic as romantic rather than as ethically fraught. And while the fantasy dimension of the story provides a partial answer to this, you could argue that the film is operating entirely within the register of fantasy, in which different rules apply and where the audience is not expected to apply the standards of psychological realism. That answer is only partially satisfying, because the film is simultaneously reaching for the affective register of genuine emotional reality. It wants you to feel that what happens between these two people is genuinely real, genuinely felt, genuinely true. And the fantasy defense only works if you are willing to accept that the film is not claiming that reality, which it is, which is exactly the tension at its center. The film wants both the intensity that comes from genuine psychological reality and the freedom from responsibility that comes from pure fantasy. And it cannot fully have both. That tension is a creative flaw, the film trying to occupy two incompatible registers at once, and it is visible in precisely those moments where the film is reaching for its most emotionally serious effects. Now, let me say this clearly because I think it is important. These are creative failures, not personal ones. The filmmakers made choices that did not all pay off. The screenplay reached for things it did not always achieve. The directorial vision was sometimes broader than the execution. These are the ordinary failures of ambitious filmmaking, and they deserve to be examined as such, with the same analytical seriousness that we would bring to the failures of any other film that was attempting something genuinely difficult. The Cine Flux does not diminish people. It examines work, and the work here, with all its flaws, was made with genuine passion and genuine creative investment. The failures are the failures of ambition, not of cynicism, and there is always more dignity in failing at something real than in succeeding at something small. Let me now move toward the emotional and intellectual core of this film, toward what it is really saying, beneath the surface of its story and above the noise of the cultural conversation that has surrounded it. Because every film that generates this much response is saying something, whether it intends to or not, and the question of what 365 days is actually communicating at the level of feeling rather than plot is the most important question we can ask about it. The first and the best thing this film is about, the emotional truth that sits at its absolute center, is the human terror of being truly seen, not admired, not desired in the abstract objectifying sense of being found attractive, but genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably seen, known for what you actually are rather than what you perform, understood in your particular combination of strengths and vulnerabilities and contradictions rather than in the simplified version of yourself that you present to the world for the sake of manageability. This is something that almost every human being both desires and fears with equal intensity. The desire to be known is one of the most fundamental of all human needs. It is what we are reaching for in every genuine relationship, every honest conversation, every moment of authentic connection. And the fear of being known is equally fundamental because to be truly seen is to be truly vulnerable, to have your defenses removed and your actual self exposed to the judgment of another person without the protection of performance or pretense. Laura, before Cicely, is living inside a performance, a very good one, sophisticated, convincing, socially successful, but a performance nonetheless. Her professional life, her relationship, her social existence are all expressions of a self she has curated for the comfort of others and the maintenance of her own sense of control. She is not being dishonest in any simple sense. She is being the person she needs to be in order to function in the world she has created for herself. But the cost of that sustained performance is a kind of interior loneliness. The specific loneliness of a person who is surrounded by people who know the performance and has almost forgotten that there is someone beneath it. What Massimo does, and here is what the film understands about this that most of its criticism has missed, is not simply remove Laura's freedom. He removes her performance. He places her in a situation where the performance is no longer possible, where the social context that the performance depends upon has been stripped away, where the identity she has constructed for herself in the world she came from has no currency in the world she has been placed into. And in that stripping away, in that enforced absence of the performance, something becomes available that was not available before: the actual person, the real Laura, the Lara who has specific desires and specific fears and a specific quality of mind and a specific way of being funny and a specific threshold for what she will and will not accept, independent of what the performance would have prescribed. This is not a comfortable truth. It is not a truth that justifies anything about the way Massimo acquires what he wants. But it is a truth that the film is genuinely exploring, and it is why the film generates more emotional resonance than a simple erotic thriller has any right to generate. Because it is touching something that is universally recognizable: the experience of having your defenses removed against your will or otherwise, and discovering in that exposure something about yourself that the defended version of you had been preventing you from knowing. We have all had versions of this experience. None of us had them in a Sicilian villa at the hands of a crime boss, but the emotional territory is recognizable. The film reaches it through a specific and deliberately heightened set of circumstances, but the destination is somewhere most of us have been, in our own quieter, less glamorous, infinitely less cinematic ways. The second thing this film is about, running parallel to the first and in constant conversation with it, is the relationship between control and desire. Not in the rhetoric sense that is usually invoked when discussing this film, the simple equation of power dynamics with eroticism, but in a deeper and more genuinely psychologically interesting sense. The question of what it means to want something that you cannot fully choose. The question of desire that arrives without your consent, that establishes itself in you before you have had a chance to examine it or approve it or decide whether it is appropriate. The question of what you do when you feel something that your conscious values and your rational self understanding would not have selected. Here is the thing about this film that almost no one in the critical conversation has acknowledged directly: the desire that develops in Laura is not presented as simple. It is presented as troubled, as conflicted, as something she fights against and returns to, and fights against as something that sits in profound tension with her own sense of who she is and what she would choose if choice were simply a matter of rationality. And that presentation of desire as complicated, as arriving in ways that are not clean or comfortable or easily categorized, is one of the most psychologically honest things about the film. Desire in real human experience is almost never simple. It does not arrive in tidily appropriate forms, neatly aligned with our values and our self concept and our social obligations. It arrives in ways that are frequently inconvenient, sometimes disturbing, often in contradiction to what our conscious mind would prescribe. The film, in its exploration of Lola's experience, is not endorsing the circumstances that gave rise to her desire. It is exploring the experience of desire itself, the way it operates outside the structures of consent and choice and rational self determination, the way it makes its own demands regardless of whether we have approved of them. Think about it this way. Some of the most enduring love stories in the history of human narrative, across every culture, every era, every literary tradition, involve desire that arrives in the wrong circumstances. Romeo and Juliet, Anna Karenina, The English Patient, Casablanca. These are stories about people who feel the most real thing they have ever felt in circumstances that are precisely the wrong circumstances for it, circumstances of family enmity, of marriage, of war, of competing obligations. What makes these stories endure is not that they endorse the circumstances, it is that they take seriously the experience of real feeling that arrives in the wrong place. 365 Days is attempting something in this tradition with significantly less literary and cinematic sophistication than any of those works, to be clear, but with a genuine understanding of the emotional territory it is entering. It is trying to take seriously the experience of desire that arrives in impossible circumstances, and that seriousness, however imperfectly executed, is the source of its emotional power. The third thing this film is about, and this one operates at a more specifically cultural level, is the experience of women in relation to stories about women's desire. This is the dimension that the cultural conversation around the film has come closest to addressing without ever quite arriving at what it most fundamentally means. The film was made by women. Blanca Lippiesca wrote it, Barbara Biauz co-directed it, and it was consumed predominantly by women, and the specifically female dimension of what it is doing deserves to be examined with the seriousness it warrants. There is a long tradition in Western culture of women's desire being defined in literature, in film, in social expectation by its relationship to men's desire. Women's desire in mainstream narrative has historically been reactive rather than active, responsive rather than initiating, defined by what it responds to rather than by what it responds to, rather than by what it reaches for. The category of what is permissible for women to want, in fiction and in life, has been narrower and more policed than the equivalent category for men, and the consequences for women who want outside the prescribed categories have historically been severe, in fiction as in life. In this context, a fantasy narrative that places a woman's desire, her specific, particular, unapologetic desire, at the absolute center of its story, that structures an entire world around the question of what she wants and what she will choose to feel, is doing something that is less culturally innocent than its surface suggests. The fantasy in 365 Days is not simply a fantasy of being wanted, it is a fantasy of wanting, of a woman's desire being the organizing principle of an entire narrative universe, of everything that happens in the story being a function of what she will or will not choose to feel. Massimo has power in the world of the film, yes. But Laura has power in the story, the power of being the character whose interior experience we are invited to inhabit, whose choices determine the narrative's direction, whose desire is the thing the whole machinery of the plot exists to serve. This is a form of narrative power that is more significant than it might appear, and it is part of what the film's primarily female audience was responding to. Not the specific circumstances of the fantasy, not the abduction, not the crime lord, not the Sicilian villa, but the deeper structural fantasy of being the center, of having your desire matter absolutely, of living inside a story in which what you feel and what you choose is the most important thing in the world. That is a fantasy that has been systematically withheld from women in mainstream narrative for a very long time. And whatever you think about how 365 Days enacts that fantasy, and there are entirely legitimate criticisms of how it does so, the fact that it is offering this particular fantasy to this particular audience at this particular cultural moment is part of what made its reception so intense and so divided. It touched a nerve not because it was transgressive in a simple sense, but because it was offering something that was felt as genuinely, specifically needed. That need is real. The question of whether this film is the right vessel for it is a separate and more complicated one. The film's relationship to the concept of obsession is worth examining with particular care because it is one of the areas where the film comes closest to something genuinely profound and also one of the areas where it is most vulnerable to the criticism that it glamorizes something genuinely dangerous. Massimo's obsession with Laura is presented as the film's central romantic gesture, the evidence of the depth of his feeling, the proof that what he experiences in relation to her is not merely desire but something closer to necessity. And the film, in its visual and musical language, frames this obsession with a kind of grandeur, with scale and beauty and the full resources of its considerable sensory arsenal, that invites you to experience it as romantic rather than pathological. Here is what I keep returning to when I think about this dimension of the film. Obsession in fiction has always occupied a complicated ethical space. The history of romantic narrative, in poetry, in the novel, in cinema, is full of obsessive loves that are celebrated rather than pathologized, that are framed as evidence of the deepest possible feeling rather than as symptoms of something that requires treatment or intervention. Heathcliff, J. Gatsby, Rochester. These are characters whose relationships to the objects of their desire are, by any clinical standard, obsessive, consuming, irrational, boundary violating in their intensity. And yet they have been cherished by readers and viewers for generations as exemplars of romantic feeling rather than as cautionary examples. 365 Days is working in this tradition, positioning Massimo's obsession as the dark, excessive, romantically grandiose version of the feeling that its audience has been taught across generations of cultural consumption to recognize as the deepest form of love. The problem is not that the film engages with this tradition. The problem is that the tradition itself carries real world weight that fiction cannot entirely bracket. The stories we tell about obsession, about the line between intensity of feeling and dangerous possession, between devotion and control, shape how people understand their own experiences and the experiences of people around them. Cinema is not responsible for everything that people do with the stories it tells, but it is not innocent of those uses either. And a film that frames obsession with this degree of beauty and grandeur without any sustained examination of what obsession actually costs, what it actually requires of the person who is its object, what the experience of being that intensely wanted actually feels like from the inside, is making a choice that has consequences beyond its own narrative. The film's use of symbols and recurring visual motifs is more considered than you might expect, and it repays attention in ways that are genuinely rewarding. The sea, which I mentioned in our discussion of the cinematography, is the film's most consistent symbolic vocabulary, but it is worth being precise about what it is doing. Water in this film is not simply beauty or sensory pleasure. It is the space where the ordinary rules of the surface world do not apply, where you cannot speak, where the usual social and psychological amateur is stripped away by simple physical immersion, where you are reduced to your most essential self. Every significant water sequence in the film coincides with a moment of genuine psychological exposure in one or both of its central characters. The water does not comment on what is happening. It creates the conditions in which it can happen. It is the film's primary space of truth, the environment in which the performance ceases to be possible and something more real becomes accessible. Understanding this gives those sequences a weight that is easy to miss if you are experiencing them purely as aesthetic pleasure. The flower motif, which appears with a consistency and a specificity that rewards attention, functions as a running visual statement about the relationship between beauty and transience, between the vitality of living things and their vulnerability to being cut from their roots. Flowers throughout the film are always shown in relation to their environments, growing in one sequence, arranged in another, pressed or fading in a third, and each iteration carries a specific emotional resonance that mirrors the state of the central relationship at that point in the narrative. The fresh, abundant flowers of the early Sicilian sequences give way gradually to more contained arrangements, to single blooms in specific spaces, and finally to imagery of flowers that have been preserved, beautiful but no longer living in the vital, unrestricted sense. whether this progression is fully intentional or partially the result of a production designer's instincts rather than a director's specific vision is impossible to know with certainty. But it is there, and it is coherent, and it adds a layer of visual meaning to the film that operates beneath the surface of its more obvious pleasures. The recurring presence of glass, windows, mirrors, transparent walls, the surfaces through which characters observe each other, is another visual motif that the film deploys with more intelligence than it is usually given credit for. Glass in this film is consistently the space between observation and participation, between seeing and being seen, between the safety of distance and the risk of genuine contact. Laura is frequently shown behind glass in the film's early sections, at windows in cars behind the transparent surfaces of Massimo's architectural world, and the gradual removal of those glass barriers across the narrative is a visual tracing of her psychological movement from defended observation to genuine presence. The moment in the film when she first chooses to step away from a window and toward Massimo is not marked by any dramatic musical swell or directorial emphasis, it is simply a movement in space. But the film has prepared you to understand it as a psychological event of the first order, and in the context of the visual grammar it has been building, it registers as exactly that. The concept of the gaze, of who looks and who is looked at, of how the camera positions its viewer in relation to the bodies on screen, is one of the most discussed theoretical dimensions of film criticism, and it is particularly relevant to any serious examination of 365 days. The film's relationship to the male gaze. The concept, developed by film theorist Laura Mulvey, that classical Hollywood cinema structures its visual pleasure around a masculine viewing position that objectifies female bodies, is more complicated and more interesting than is sometimes acknowledged. Yes, the film presents bodies, both of its leads, as objects of visual pleasure. Yes, certain sequences are constructed to deliver the specific pleasures of beautiful bodies in extraordinary spaces, presented for the audience's appreciation. But the film is also consistently interested in how Laura looks at Massimo, in her gaze, her desire, her visual pleasure in him, in a way that complicates the simple application of male gaze theory to its visual logic. Cinema rarely centers a woman's gaze as the organizing visual principle of its most charged sequences with this kind of consistency. And the fact that 365 days does that, it is as interested in showing us what Laura sees and how she sees it as it is in showing us what Massimo sees, is a visual and political choice that deserves acknowledgement. The camera here is not simply a male eye surveying a female body, it is at least as often a female eye surveying a male one, and the pleasure it is offering, the specific sensory and emotional pleasure of watching this particular man in these particular spaces, is being offered with a directness and an unashamed specificity that represents something genuinely unusual in mainstream commercial cinema. The film's willingness to construct male beauty as an object of female visual pleasure, and to do so without apology or complication, is one of its most quietly radical qualities. And it is not coincidentally one of the qualities that its primarily female audience responded to most strongly. Now, this film belongs to a larger story. It is the first chapter of a trilogy, and the question of its place within that larger narrative is worth addressing with specific care, because the decisions the first film makes establish the terms on which everything that follows will be understood. As the opening chapter of what became a three-part story, 365 Days has a specific narrative responsibility that it only partially fulfills. The function of a first film in a series is not simply to tell its own story, but to establish a world, to introduce characters with sufficient depth and specificity that the audience will want to return to them, and to create the conditions for a continuing narrative that feels genuinely necessary rather than commercially convenient. The world building in 365 Days is accomplished more effectively through visual and atmospheric means than through narrative and character development, which creates a foundation for the series that is more aesthetically solid than it is dramatically solid. What the first film does well in terms of establishing the series is the central dynamic between Laura and Massimo. The The chemistry between the leads, the genuine felt quality of their interactions, creates an investment in these specific people that carries through to the subsequent films, regardless of what those films do with the characters. You want to know what happens to them. Not because the screenplay has constructed them with extraordinary depth, but because the performers have brought them to genuine life in enough moments that the investment is real. That is a significant achievement for a series opener, and it is not something that can be taken for granted. What the first film does less well is establish the full complexity of its world. The crime organization that Massimo inhabits, the social and cultural context of his world, the specific nature of the power he holds, and the dangers it creates. The series expands this world in its subsequent entries, but the first film's treatment of it as backdrop rather than substance means that the expansion in later films sometimes feels like it is arriving in a context that was never sufficiently prepared. The second and third films in the series, the next 365 Days and 365 Days, this day, attempt to deepen the world the first film established, with mixed results that reflect both the expanded resources of a successful series and the structural limitations of a foundation that was built more for emotional impact than for narrative architecture. Here is what the first film adds to the larger conversation of the series that the subsequent films never quite recapture: the quality of discovery. The experience of entering this world for the first time, of encountering these characters in their initial unrepeatable form, of arriving at this particular dynamic without the accumulated weight of sequel expectations. That quality of newness, of genuine first encounter, is something the sequels inherit but cannot reproduce. And it is worth identifying because it is part of what makes the first film the most cinematically interesting of the three, despite, or perhaps because of its imperfections. The sequels are in some ways more polished, more confident in their visual ambitions, more experienced in their handling of the world they are inhabiting. But they have lost the rawness that makes the first film genuinely alive in its best moments. They have gained craft at the cost of something less tangible but more essential, the quality of something being discovered rather than constructed. The first film also carries within it a quality of genuine uncertainty, of a narrative that does not yet know exactly where it is going, that gives it a particular energy. The story is not playing out according to a predetermined design that the audience can sense beneath the surface. It is, or it feels like, something being worked out in real time. A story and a relationship and a set of questions that are genuinely in play, rather than being moved toward a conclusion that was decided before filming began. That quality of genuine uncertainty, of a world in which you cannot be entirely sure what will happen next, not because the plot is particularly surprising, but because the emotional and psychological situation feels genuinely unresolved, is one of the most valuable things a film can offer. And it is a quality that the first film has in ways the sequels, which are more obviously shaped by audience expectation and commercial consideration, do not. In terms of what the first film sets up for the series, the most significant establishment is also the most narratively incomplete. The question of whether what has developed between Laura and Massimo constitutes genuine love in any meaningful sense. This question is the series' central concern across all three films, the question that each subsequent film will approach from a different angle, with different levels of success, using the foundation the first film has laid. The first film earns the question, it does not earn the answer. And that inclusion, that specific quality of a story that has established its central question without resolving it, is what creates the conditions for the series to continue. Whether the series ultimately answers the question with the wisdom and seriousness it deserves is a conversation for another day. But the question itself, as established by the first film, is the right question. It is the question that all the best love stories ask. And the fact that 365 Days is asking it in the middle of everything else it is doing, in the middle of its most spectacular and its most problematic sequences, in the midst of all the cultural noise it generated, is the most genuinely interesting and the most cinematically serious thing about it. The franchise also raises specific question about how series storytelling functions in the streaming era, a question that 365 Days is particularly well placed to illuminate. The model of the streaming series, in which a story is designed from the beginning to be consumed in multiple installments, changes the relationship between a narrative and its audience in ways that are still being understood. The first film in this trilogy was not originally conceived as the first installment of a planned streaming franchise. It was a theatrical film that became a streaming phenomenon and then, because of that phenomenon, was retroactively positioned as the beginning of a series. The sequels were produced in response to the demand that the first film generated, rather than being planned alongside it as part of a unified creatization. This distinction matters because it shapes the nature of the series in fundamental ways. The first film has the coherence and the specific quality of a complete artistic vision, imperfect and contradictory as that vision sometimes is, that was not made with the awareness that it would need to leave narrative threads dangling for future installments. The sequels have the more fragmented, more commercially responsive quality of stories that were produced in awareness of an audience that had already formed expectations. And the creative consequences of that distinction are visible in both the strengths and the limitations of the series as a whole. In the way the first film's questions are sometimes deepened by what follows and sometimes cheapened by it. In the way the characters are both developed and occasionally betrayed across the trilogy's arc. What the first film leaves behind as its most significant contribution to the series, beyond the world and the characters and the questions, is an emotional standard. A standard of genuine feeling, of the specific quality of two people who are genuinely alive to each other on screen, that the subsequent films are always being measured against. The first film set a bar not of quality in the conventional critical sense, but of authenticity, of the felt sense that something real is happening between these two people in front of this camera in this specific place and time. And it is a bar that the series in its later entries achieves moments of but never sustains throughout. The chemistry of the original, the specific Sieklucka and Morrone in their first shared space, is the thing the franchise is always reaching back toward, always trying to recapture, and never quite fully recapturing, because that particular quality of first encounter, of discovery and uncertainty and the rawness of something not yet settled into its own conventions, belongs to the first film and cannot be imported into what follows. That is the nature of first things, and it is, I think, a genuinely poignant dimension of what this film is and what it means within the larger story it began. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. Now, for those of you who have seen it. For those of you who sat through the full experience and arrived at that ending and felt something you perhaps could not immediately name, this section is for you. Let us go all the way in. The film opens, as I mentioned in our earlier discussion, not with Laura but with Massimo. And it is worth returning to this opening now with the full knowledge of where the film goes, because it is more carefully constructed than it initially appears, and its implications reach further into the narrative than a single viewing might reveal. We see Massimo at a moment of absolute powerlessness, a man who controls an empire of violence and money, watching the woman he loves die in front of him during an attack that his own word generated. She is not named. She is barely glimpsed. She is present in the film as an absence almost from her first appearance, a face that registers on Massimo's face rather than on the camera directly. And what this framing accomplishes is something quietly significant. It establishes that the woman Massimo is mourning is not a fully realized person in his understanding of her, but an image, a projection, a feeling that attached itself to a face and became, in the intensity of loss, something more absolute than any actual person could sustain. This is the psychological foundation on which the entire film is built, and understanding it changes everything that follows. When Massimo sees Lara for the first time across a hotel lobby in Warsaw, in what the film presents as a moment of almost supernatural recognition, what he is experiencing is not love at first sight in the conventional romantic sense. He is experiencing the return of something he thought was permanently lost. Laura resembles the woman he lost. Not in a simple literal photographic sense, the film is careful not to make this equivalence too explicit, but in some quality that registers for Massimo as recognition rather than simply attraction. He sees in her face something that his grief has been reaching toward, and that reaching, that desperate need to find again what was taken from him, is what he calls love. Think about what that means for the entire central dynamic of the film. Massimo does not fall in love with Laura, he falls in love with what Laura makes possible, the continuation of a feeling that her loss interrupted. He is not seeing Laura when he first looks at her. He is seeing the restoration of something he thought was gone forever. And the profound question the film is asking, the question that sits beneath all of its more spectacular surfaces, is what happens when the person who has been cast in this role of restoration begins to insist on being seen for who she actually is, rather than for what she represents to the person who has placed her in that role. What happens when the image becomes a person? What happens when Massimo is required to see Laura rather than the reflection of his loss? The answer the film gives, and this is its most interesting narrative argument, is that this process of genuine seeing is what transforms what began as obsession into something that begins to resemble love. The art of the film is not at its deepest level the arc of a woman falling for her captor. It is the arc of a man learning to see a specific person rather than a projected image. And the agency Laura exercises throughout her refusals, her provocations, her insistence on her own perspective and her own desires is the force that drives that transformation. She refuses to be the image, she insists on being herself, and in that insistence, she does something that Massimo had not anticipated and cannot control. She becomes real to him, not as a replacement for what he lost, as herself, as a new thing entirely. This psychological arc is the film's greatest achievement at a level of narrative design, and it is an achievement that the film obscures somewhat by surrounding it with so much sensory spectacle. The arc is there, it is coherent, it is emotionally logical, but it requires you to look beneath the surface to find it, to do a certain amount of interpretive work that the film does not always make easy. And the fact that this level of psychological architecture exists in a film that is primarily consumed for its more surface pleasures is part of what makes it genuinely interesting rather than simply provocative. Let us move through the major turning points of the narrative with the care they deserve. The first major turning points, the moment the film shifts from establishing its situation to genuinely complicating it, arrives in a scene that has been somewhat overshadowed in the cultural conversation by the film's more visually spectacular sequences, but that is, in my judgment, the film's most dramatically significant scene in its first half. It is the scene in which Nora refuses. Not physically, Massimo has not attempted anything that requires that kind of refusal, but psychologically. There is a moment where Massimo has arranged something elaborate, something that reveals the scope of his attention to her, his detailed knowledge of her tastes and preferences, his meticulous study of who she is. And rather than being moved by this, rather than softening in the way that the film's romantic logic would seem to require at this point, Laura is disturbed by it, unsettled in a way that goes beyond the obvious discomfort of her situation, because what she understands in this moment is that being studied this carefully by someone who has removed your freedom is not the same as being known. It is a form of possession, a claiming of territory rather than a genuine act of recognition. And her refusal to respond to it with gratitude or warmth, her insistence on naming the distinction between being studied and being seen, is the moment where her character becomes fully three-dimensional and where the film's central psychological question becomes explicit. This scene is also the moment where the power dynamic of the film begins to become genuinely complicated in ways that go beyond the obvious structural power Massimo holds, because Laura's fizzle, her psychological non-compliance, her insistence on maintaining an inner territory that his attention cannot colonize, is a form of power that his money and his influence and his physical presence cannot override. You can control a person's circumstances without controlling their inner life. You can observe someone in exhaustive detail without genuinely knowing them. And the film in this scene is making a distinction between possession and intimacy That is the most intellectually serious thing it does across its entire running time. Possession is the removal of freedom, intimacy is the granting of access, and access, unlike possession, cannot be taken, it can only be given. This is what Massimo does not yet understand at this point in the film, and this is what Laura, without fully articulating it, through the simple act of her refusal, is beginning to teach him. The yacht sequence, which is the film's most discussed and most culturally prominent scene, and which I have been deliberately holding back in order to address it here in the context of the full narrative, deserves more careful examination than it typically receives in the conversation around this film. Yes, it is the film's most visually audacious sequence. Yes, it is the sequence that generated the most immediate and intense cultural response. Yes, it is the sequence that most clearly demonstrates both what the film is capable of at its most cinematically committed and what it risks by committing so fully to sensation over psychological complexity. All of that is true. But what I want to talk about here is what the scene is doing narratively and psychologically, because that dimension is more interesting and more significant than the purely surface discussion usually acknowledges. The odd sequence is the film's central act of Laura's autonomous desire. I want to be precise about this because precision matters enormously here. This is the scene in which Laura chooses, not passively, not in response to something Massimo has initiated, not as a concession or a surrender, but as an active, initiated, fully owned act of her own wanting. She has been placed in an environment of extraordinary beauty and complete remove from the world she came from. She has been living for weeks in proximity to someone whose desire for her has been expressed with a consistency and an intensity that she has consistently refused to meet. And then, in this specific moment, in this specific place, something shifts in her, not because of anything Massimo does, because of something she decides, because of a moment in which she stops arguing with what she feels and simply feels it. What the film understands about this moment, and this is what I keep returning to, is that it is not a capitulation. It is not the moment where the narrative finally achieves what Massimo wanted from the beginning and where Lara's resistance is revealed to have been merely delay. It is the moment where Lara's desire, her specific, particular, chosen desire, becomes the organizing force of the scene rather than Massimo's. The shift in the power dynamic in this sequence is profound and is written entirely in the visual language of who is initiating and who is responding, who is moving toward and who is being moved toward and who is being moved toward. It is Lara who closes the distance. It is Lara who makes the first decisive gesture. It is Lara who transforms the situation from one of maintained tension to one of genuine mutual presence. And the film, to its considerable credit, knows this. The camera knows this. The framing of the sequence honors this. In this moment, despite everything that preceded it, despite the entire context of coercion and removal of choice that surrounds this situation, there is something happening that is genuinely and specifically hers. Is that enough to redeem the circumstances? No, the film does not ask you to think that it is. And any reading of the sequence as a moral resolution of the ethical problems the film has raised is a misreading. But it is a moment of genuine psychological truth, a moment in which a character makes a real choice within the circumstances she has been placed in, and in which that choice is honored by the film as genuinely hers, rather than as something extracted from her. And that distinction between genuine choice within constrained circumstances and the appearance of choice without the reality is precisely the distinction the film has been building toward since its opening frames. The aftermath of this sequence is where the film begins to reveal its deeper intentions regarding the central relationship, and it is worth tracking carefully because it is where the film's psychological architecture becomes most explicit. Following this pivotal moment, the dynamic between Laura and Massimo undergoes a fundamental change that the film renders not through dialogue or explicit narrative, but through the purely cinematic means of space and proximity and the quality of attention the characters bring to each other. They begin to occupy space differently. The careful managed distance that characterized their earlier interactions gives way to something more fluid, more mutually responsive, less governed by the structural power that Massimo holds, and more by the specific, developing quality of two people who are beginning to genuinely know each other. There is a sequence, relatively brief and positioned in the film's second half as a kind of tonal counterweight to the more charged sequences around it, in which Laura and Massimo are simply together in the ordinary way of people who have passed some threshold of intimacy and arrived at something quieter and more sustainable. They are not performing for each other. They are not negotiating or provoking or resisting or reaching. They are simply present together in a domestic space, doing ordinary things, and the ordinariness of it is the most extraordinary thing the film has yet shown. Because it is in these moments of ordinary shared existence, in the unremarkable proximity of two people who have genuinely arrived at something, that the film makes its most persuasive case for the reality of what has developed between them. Not in the spectacular sequences, not in the charged and visually ambitious set pieces, but in this quite unheroic, completely ordinary shared moment. This is what intimacy looks like when it is real, not grandeur, ordinariness, the willingness to simply be in the same space without performance or effort. This sequence also accomplishes something else, something more specific to the film's psychological argument. It shows us Massimo without his armor, without the careful management of presence and power that characterizes him in every other dimension of his life. He is, in this domestic space with Laura, simply a person. Someone who can be unglamorous, who can be unguarded, who can exist in the mundane register of daily life without the scaffolding of identity and power that the rest of the film surrounds him with. And this revelation that beneath the spectacular, threatening, obsessively controlled figure of the film's first half, there is simply a man, someone capable of ordinary presence and ordinary vulnerability, is the film's most important character revelation. It is what justifies the emotional journey the film has asked you to take. Because you cannot fully believe in a love story unless you believe that both people in it are capable of being simply human in each other's presence, and this scene provides that belief. The revelation about Laura's past, the information the film discloses about her life before Sicily, about the specific quality of her emotional history, about what she has experienced in relation to love and loss before any of this began, arrives at a moment in the narrative that is precisely calculated to recontextualize everything we have understood about her up to this point. I will not specify the exact nature of this revelation even in spoiler territory because its specific content is less important than its structural function in the narrative. What it does is deepen Laura's interiority in a way that the film has been preparing but not delivering throughout its first half. It gives her a history, a specific, particular, irreducible personal history that makes her something more than the object of Massimo's projection. It makes her a person with her own losses, her own wounds, her own reasons for the guardedness and the performed sufficiency that characterized her before Sicily. And what is most interesting about this revelation is the timing of it, the fact that it arrives after the central relationship has already reached a point of genuine mutual investment rather than before. In a more conventional narrative, this kind of character backstory revelation would come early. It would be deployed as explanation, as the justification for the character's behavior, and as the key that unlocks her emotional availability. Here it arrives late. It arrives after you have already formed your understanding of Laura through observation rather than explanation. And its lateness is itself meaningful. It suggests that the film understands the difference between explaining a character and revealing one, between providing information about a person and allowing you to genuinely know them. The late revelation does not change who Laura is, it deepens who she already was, and that is the difference between backstory as mechanics and backstory as genuine characterization. The confrontation scene, the scene I identified in our earlier discussion as Sieklucka's finest moment, arrives in the film's third act as the dramatic culmination of the psychological arc that has been building since the beginning. Laura and Massimo face each other with the full complexity of their situation explicitly present between them, not as a background condition to be managed around, not as something the film continues to bracket in order to focus on the pleasures of their developing dynamic, but as the actual subject of the conversation. What is this? What are we doing? What does it mean that I feel what I feel in these circumstances? These are the questions the scene is circling, and the film, in this moment, does something it has not done consistently enough throughout. It slows down. It gives the scene time. It allows the silence to do what silence does in moments of genuine emotional risk. It allows the full weight of what is at stake to settle into the scene and to be felt rather than moved past. Laura's words in this scene, which I am paraphrasing rather than reproducing, in accordance with the principles that govern this channel, amount to a kind of reckoning. She's not simply expressing what she feels, she's examining what she feels, questioning it, refusing to accept it uncritically even as she cannot deny it. She is being, in other words, honest, not in the sense of transparency about emotion, but in the deeper sense of refusing to simplify a complicated inner experience for the sake of either romantic narrative or moral clarity. She is neither simply surrendering to her feelings nor simply repudiating them. She is sitting with the full complexity of them, with all their contradictions and their discomforts, and demanding that Massimo meet her in that complexity rather than in the simplified version of it that the fantasy framework of their situation would prefer. This is the scene where the film earns its most significant credit, because the conversation that takes place here is at its core about the ethics of what has happened between them, about what it means to feel something genuine in circumstances that were not genuine, about whether the authenticity of what has developed can retroactively justify its origins, about the difference between what Massimo intended when he took Laura and what actually happened as a result. These are not questions the film fully resolves, but it asks them here with a directness and a seriousness that redeems much of what the film has been somewhat evasive about in its earlier sections. The questions are finally being asked in the open rather than existing as subtext, and the fact that they are being asked, and that the film is willing to let them remain genuinely unresolved, genuinely difficult, genuinely weighted with all the complexity the situation requires, is the moment where the film achieves something it has been reaching for throughout. Massimo's response in this scene is equally significant and equally worth examining. He does not defend himself. He does not deplore the justifications that his character's worldview might readily provide, the language of destiny or necessity, or the intensity of feeling that supersedes ordinary moral categories. He simply acknowledges. He acknowledges what he did, and what it was, and what it cost her, and the fact that nothing he could offer would be equivalent to what he took. There is no negotiation in this image, no qualification. It is simply a person recognizing what they have done and offering no mitigation, only the reality of what has developed in spite of everything, and a question of whether that reality is enough, whether it can be enough, whether there is a version of what they have become to each other that can exist without the death of its origin contaminating it permanently. This is a genuinely difficult question, and the film does not answer it cheaply. It does not manufacture a resolution that erases the difficulty. What it offers instead is something more honest and more interesting, the sense that both people are choosing to remain present with the question rather than running from it in either direction. They are not resolving anything. They are deciding to try anyway, with full awareness of what trying means and what it costs. That is a more mature emotional conclusion than the film is usually given credit for reaching. It is not a fairy tale ending dressed as something more serious. It is a genuinely complicated human conclusion, two people choosing something imperfect and difficult and real over the simpler alternatives of surrender or abandonment. The film's final act moves with a purposefulness and an emotional directness that represents its best sustained dramatic writing. The world begins to intrude on the enclosed space Laura and Massimo have created together. The crime world that Massimo inhabits, which has been present throughout the film as atmosphere and backstory, now asserts itself as immediate narrative reality. There are threats, there are consequences. There is the specific quality of danger that attaches to a world where violence is always a possible instrument of any conflict. And the film's management of this intrusion is interesting because of how it affects the central dynamic, because of the way it forces both characters to confront the full reality of what being together actually means in terms of the world Massimo inhabits, the world Laura would have to inhabit if she chooses to remain. This dimension of the final act, The collision between the emotional truth of the central relationship and the practical reality of the world it exists within is where the film is at its most genuinely thriller adjacent, and it handles the genre mechanics with more confidence than you might expect. The pacing tightens, the visual language becomes more urgent. The music changes register from the atmospheric, slow burning emotional landscapes of the central sections to something with more immediate physical presence, more rhythm and momentum. And this tonal shift accomplishes something important. It reminds you, after the relative stillness of the film's most intimate sections, that the world outside the enclosed space of Laura and Massimo's developing relationship is real and dangerous and has claims on them that no amount of personal feeling can entirely override. But the final act's most significant achievement is also its most quietly devastating one, and it arrives not in any of the thriller mechanics, but in a completely ordinary moment, a moment so simple and so unspectacular that it almost passes without registering. There is a scene in which Massimo does something for Laura that has nothing to do with grand gesture or spectacular provision. He does something small, something specific to who she actually is rather than who he needs her to be. And in this small specific act, in this evidence of genuine attention to her particular self rather than to the image of her he began with, the film makes its most persuasive case for the reality of what has developed between them, because this is what love actually looks like when it is real, not the grand gesture, the small specific one. The evidence that someone has been paying attention to you, to the actual you, the particular irreplaceable individual you, rather than to the idea of you. This moment carries more emotional weight than anything else in the film's final act, and it earns it completely. Now we arrive at the ending. And the ending of 365 Days is quite genuinely one of the most discussed and most controversial endings in the history of streaming cinema. It arrived as a shock, not a carefully prepared narrative surprise, but a sudden, brutal, almost cavalier rupture in the emotional contract the film had been building with its audience. Film ends without warning or preparation in the middle of a tunnel. Lara and Massimo are in a car. They're happy, genuinely, quietly, aren'tly happy in the way that the film has spent its entire running time moving toward. And then the screen cuts to black, and the film is over. And what has happened in those final seconds before the cut, what has been implied rather than shown, what has been suggested rather than delivered, is the kind of ending that does not feel like an artistic choice so much as an interruption, as though the film has been cut off mid sentence rather than concluded. The deliberate ambiguity of this ending is worth examining with care, because it has been interpreted in dramatically different ways by different viewers, and the interpretation you arrive at depends almost entirely on what you believe the film was fundamentally about and what kind of resolution that story requires. One reading, the darker one, sees the ending as a form of narrative honesty, a way of saying that the world Massimo inhabits does not resort neatly into happiness, that the crime world has a claim on him and on anyone who is with him that no amount of genuine love can override, that the arc of obsession and possession that began this story cannot arrive at the destination of ordinary domestic happiness without the generated it extracting a cost. This reading positions the ending as the film's most morally serious moment, the point where it refuses the easy resolution and insists on the full weight of what being in this world actually means. The other reading, the one that the sequels implicitly adopt, sees the ending not as conclusion but as transition, as the end of a chapter rather than the end of a story, as a cliffhanger rather than a moral statement. This reading positions the ambiguity as a narrative device rather than an artistic one, a way of creating the appetite for continuation that a successful franchise requires. And while this reading is less aesthetically interesting than the first, it is probably the more accurate account of what the filmmakers actually intended, given that a sequel was reportedly already in development at the time of the ending's creation. What I find most interesting about the ending, more interesting than either of its specific possible meanings, is what it reveals about the film's relationship to genre. The ending of 365 Days revises the generic expectation that the romance narrative has been building throughout. Romance as a genre has a specific and deeply embedded structural promise: the lovers will be together. That is the contract genre makes with its audience from its opening pages or frames. And a film that has been operating within the drama of romance, that has been building its pleasures and its emotional investments entirely around the romantic logic of two people moving toward each other, breaks that contract at the last possible moment by introducing the possibility of irreversible separation. Whether this is brave or manipulative, whether it is an act of genuine artistic refusal or simply a cliffhanger dressed as meaningful ambiguity, is a question that sits at the heart of how you ultimately experience this film. My own feeling about the ending, and I want to be honest about this because honest personal response is what this channel is for, is that it is simultaneously the film's bravest moment and its most frustrating one. It is brave because it refuses the comfort that everything that preceded it seemed to be leading toward. It is frustrating because the film has not done the full psychological and dramatic work that would make such a refusal feel genuinely earned rather than simply imposed. A devastating ending is only as powerful as the story that precedes it, and 365 Days has not built its narrative architecture with sufficient rigor to make the devastation of its ending feel like an inevitable consequence rather than an arbitrary one. The ending arrives as a rupture rather than as a culmination. And the difference between a rupture and a culmination is the difference between a film that earns its ending and a film that is taken over by it. What I keep returning to, and this speaks to something more fundamental than the mechanics of plot, is the emotional experience of those final moments, the sudden shift from warmth to silence. The way the film takes the specific earned quality of happiness it has built toward across its entire running time and places it in direct proximity to the possibility of its permanent removal. The cruelty of that juxtaposition is real, and whether or not the film earns it by the standards of narrative rigor, it earns it by the standards of emotional truth, because this is how happiness is actually experienced in the world, not as a destination arrived at and secured, but as a condition that always exists in the shadow of its possible loss. The film in its ending is saying something about the nature of happiness itself, about the way it is always already vulnerable, always already aware of its own fragility, always carrying within it the knowledge of how quickly and completely it can be taken. And that truth, however clumsily the film arrives at it, however much the mechanics of its delivery can be questioned, is a genuinely true thing. It is the truest thing the film says. And I have not forgotten it. The foreshadowing that the film plans for this ending is, in retrospect, considerably more visible than a first viewing might suggest. The opening sequence, Massimo's loss, the violence that defined his world before Laura, is not simply backstory. It is a structural echo, a formal announcement that this is a world in which the people you love can be taken from you without warning, in which the happiness you have built can be unmade in an instant by forces that have no interest in what you have earned or what you have become. The flowers, with their visual language of beautiful things cut from their roots of vitality that is always already impermanent, are present throughout the film as a quiet, persistent reminder of transience. Even the tunnel imagery of the ending is prepared for earlier in the film, not in a heavy-handed way, but in the accumulation of enclosed spaces, of darkness entered and sometimes exited and sometimes not, that runs through the visual language of the narrative as a whole. There are no post-credit scenes in 365 Days. The film ends where it ends, without coda or supplement, and the darkness after the cut is simply darkness, no mitigation, no re-establishment, no reassurance. Just the sudden absence of a word you have been inside for nearly 2 hours. And that absence, that specific quality of having been inside something and then finding yourself suddenly outside it, with nothing to hold on to but what the experience left in you, is the final thing the film gives you. Not a conclusion, a resonance, the feeling of something that was real and is now gone, echoing in the space where it was. Let me step away from analysis now. Let me put down the critical framework and the cultural context and the careful examination of craft and simply speak as someone who sat with this film and felt it. because that is ultimately what cinema asks of us, not our judgment, but our presence. And this film, for all its contradictions and its imperfections and the legitimate questions it raises, asked for my presence, and I gave it, and something happened in that giving that I want to try to be honest about. The single moment that has not left me, the moment I return to when I think about this film without the scaffolding of analysis, is not one of the spectacular sequences. It is not the yacht. It is not the Sicilian coastlines or the charged confrontations or the ending that cuts to black. It is that small, quiet, entirely unspectacular moment I described in our spoiler section. The moment where Massimo does something small and specific for Laura, something that demonstrates genuine attention to who she actually is. I keep returning to it because it is the moment where the film stops reaching for grandeur and simply tells the truth. And the truth, when it arrives in a film that has been so consistently drawn toward the spectacular, lands with a weight that all the spectacle in the world cannot manufacture. That moment matters to me because it is a moment I recognize. Not from anything resembling the circumstances of this film. My life is considerably less cinematic, I'm glad to report, but from the interior experience of what it feels like to be genuinely seen by another person. The specific quality of it, the way it is always smaller than you expected, always more ordinary than the romantic imagination prepares you for, always arriving in some unremarkable gesture or some passing attention to detail that says more clearly than any grand declaration could, I have been paying attention to you specifically, not to the idea of you, to the actual, particular, irreplaceable you. That is what love is when it is real, not the intensity, not the obsession, not the grand gesture or the spectacular provision. The small specific thing, the evidence of sustained, patient, genuine attention. And the fact that 365 Days, which is in so many ways a film about the spectacular, the intense, the excessive, finds this truth in one of its quietest moments, is perhaps its most genuinely moving achievement. The film knows, somewhere in itself, what love actually looks like. It is not always brave enough to commit to showing it, but in this moment it is, and I have not forgotten it. Did this film change how I say something? Yes, but perhaps not in the way you might expect. It did not change how I see desire or power or the ethics of romantic narrative or any of the large categories that the cultural conversation around this film has been organized around. It changed how I see the gap, the specific, persistent, poignant gap between what a film is trying to say and what it actually manages to say. That gap is present in every film. In most films, it is simply a limitation, something that falls short without the falling short being particularly interesting. But in 395 days, the gap itself is the most interesting thing. The film it is trying to be, the film suggested by its finest moments, by the performances at its center, by the psychological questions it raises and occasionally examines with genuine seriousness, is a more compelling film than the one that actually exists on screen. And sitting with that gap, understanding it rather than simply noting it, recognizing what it reveals about the nature of artistic ambition and the difficulty of translating genuine feeling into genuine cinema, that was the unexpected gift this film gave me. The gift of understanding something more precisely about the distance between intention and achievement in art. Would I return to this film? Yes, not in the way you return to a great film, not with the anticipation of being moved in the way you were moved the first time, of being surprised and challenged and deepened again, but in the way you return to something that you have a complicated relationship with, in the way you return to something that contains both more and less than you hoped for, and that the contradiction of more and less continues to be interesting enough to revisit. I would return to the performances, particularly Sieklucka's. I would return to the cinematography and the specific quality of the Sicilian light. I would return to the musical choices that worked, the ones where image and sound genuinely amplified each other into something neither could achieve alone. And I would return to that small, quiet moment of genuine seeing, which is the truest thing in the film, and which is, I think, the truest thing the film was always trying to get to. The kind of person who will carry this film with them is someone who is willing to sit with contradiction, Someone who can hold the experience of genuine feeling alongside the honest recognition of genuine flaw, who is not looking for a film to be either entirely condemned. It is a film for people who understand that the most interesting things in art are often the things that do not quite resolve, the questions that remain genuinely open, the feelings that exceed the capacity of the form that generated them, the gap between what was reached for and what was grasped. If you are the kind of person who finds that gap interesting rather than simply disappointing, this film has something for you. If you need a film to be entirely coherent in order to be worth your time, this film will frustrate you at every turn. Both of those responses are honest. Both of them tell you something true about who you are as a viewer and what you ask of cinema. Now, let me bring everything together into the honest conclusion this film deserves. 355 Days is a film that I would not call great and cannot call negligible, a film that occupies the complicated middle territory where the most interesting things often live. It is a film that reaches genuinely and imperfectly for something real, and that, in reaching in the specific quality of its aspiration, reveals more about the human experience of desire and longing and the need to be truly known than its surface would ever suggest. It is flawed in ways that are specific and significant, and that prevent it from becoming what its finest moments suggest it could be. It is also, and this must be said clearly and without embarrassment, genuinely, undeniably alive in ways that a great deal of more technically accomplished cinema is not. The performances at its center are better than the film deserves, and they are better than the film's critics have generally acknowledged. Sieklucka in particular carries within her performance a psychological complexity and a quality of authentic presence that elevates the material at every point of contact. The visual language of the film, at its best, achieves a genuine cinematic beauty that goes beyond aesthetic pleasure into something that functions as emotional argument. The musical landscape is more intelligent and more intentional than its surface pleasures would suggest. And the central question the film is asking, the question of what happens when genuine feeling develops in circumstances that were not designed for it, is a genuinely important human question, asked here with imperfect tools but with genuine seriousness of purpose. The film's failures are real and should not be minimized. The screenplay does not consistently match the ambitions of its performances. The pacing is uneven in ways that undermine the emotional coherence of the central arc. The moral complexity of the central situation is engaged with genuinely in isolated moments, but is not sustained throughout with the rigor it requires. The secondary characters are underdeveloped in ways that hollow out the world around the central relationship. And the ending, however brave it is in intention, does not fully earn the devastation it attempts. Who will love this most deeply? People who come to cinema for emotional immersion rather than narrative rigor. People who are interested in the psychology of desire, not as an academic subject but as a lived experience. People who can watch a film that raises difficult questions without requiring it to answer them neatly. People who are moved by genuine chemistry between performers, by the specific quality of two people who are genuinely alive to each other on screen. And people who are willing to do the interpretive work that this film requires, to look beneath its surface pleasures for the more serious inquiry that sits beneath them, imperfectly realized but genuinely present, who may not connect with it, people who need narrative coherence and moral clarity from their cinema. People for whom the ethical dimensions of the central premise are too significant to set aside in order to access the film's other qualities. People who find the genre conventions of the captivity romance fundamentally at odds with their understanding of what romantic narrative should do. All of these responses are entirely legitimate. None of them are wrong. They are simply different agreements about what we ask of cinema and what we are willing to meet it with. As for our viewing context, this is a film for a screen rather than a cinema, for the intimacy of a private viewing space rather than a shared public one. It is a film designed for the streaming environment that made it famous, and it is best experienced in that environment. It is not a film to own in the sense of a work of reference cinema that you will return to for the precision of its craft. It is a film to experience, to be inside for its running time. to feel in the way that it asks to be felt, and to sit with afterward in the space it leaves behind. My rating for 265 days is 5.8 out of 10. And here is the one true sentence that earns it. This is a film that contains genuine feeling in imperfect form, that reaches for something real with tools that are not always equal to the reaching, and that in that specific and very human combination of aspiration and limitation becomes more interesting, more worth examining, and more worth feeling than either its admirers or its critics have typically been willing to say. Cinema, at its most honest, is not always about perfection. It is sometimes about the specific quality of something that tried, that reached past its own limitations toward something more true and more felt and more genuinely human than the safe, the polished, and the merely accomplished. These 65 days tried, imperfectly, contradictorily, with uneven results and genuine passion and a central emotional truth that it found in spite of itself. And there is something in that trying, in the specific, visible, honest trying of it, that I find more moving than I expected to. More moving, perhaps, than the film deserves. But then, the best things cinema gives us are often more than what the film strictly deserves. That is the mystery of it. That is why we keep coming back. Now, before I let you go, and I want to hold you here just a moment longer, because this conversation has been a real one and real conversations deserve a real ending. I want to say something genuine. Thank you for being here. Not in the transactional sense of a channel thanking its audience for the metrics their presence provides, but in the actual sense. This channel exists because there are people who feel cinema the way I feel it, who want to understand what they experience, who find that understanding deepens rather than diminishes the feeling, who believe that the critical and the emotional are not opposites but partners in the same act of attention. You are those people. And making something for you, thinking carefully about something, and then bringing that thinking to you in the hope that it adds something to your experience of the world is a genuine privilege. So, thank you, really. If this essay moved something in you, if it gave you a new way into a film you had already seen, or a reason to see a film you had been avoiding, or simply the feeling of having spent time inside a conversation that mattered, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you think about this film. Tell me where you agree and where you think I got it completely wrong. Tell me what the ending meant to you and what moment you keep returning to, and whether the gap between what this film is and what it was trying to be interests you or simply frustrates you. These conversations should not end here. The best conversations about cinema never end in the film itself. They begin there and then travel somewhere further, somewhere more personal, somewhere that is really about you rather than about the screen. A few specific things I would love to know from you. First, do you think the ending of this film is a brave artistic choice or a narrative manipulation? The tunnel, the silence, the cut to black, what did it do to you? Second, at what point, if any, did you genuinely believe in what was developing between Laura and Massimo? Was there a specific moment where the film earned your emotional investment, or did it never quite get there? And third, what does it mean to you that a film like this, one with this specific set of ethical complexities, generated such an enormous, passionate global audience? What does that response tell us about what people are looking for in stories about love and desire? In our next essay, we are going to be entering a completely different world, a different kind of story, a different kind of cinema, a different kind of emotional territory entirely. I am not going to tell you exactly what it is, but I will say this: if this essay was about the complexity of desire in impossible circumstances, the next one is about the complexity of identity in impossible circumstances. And the question at its heart, the question we are going to sit with together, carefully and with full attention, is one of the oldest and most urgent questions that cinema has ever tried to answer. I think you are going to want to be there for it. That is the Cine Flux. I will see you in the next one.